In 1936, the world was about to launch itself in a new era of war and chaos once more. Countries were on the brink of collapse with revolutions and civil wars looming, waiting to be unleashed at the right time. The German Empire stood strong for many years, but was now exhausted, much like their leader. The result of these nations today stirred from the Weltkrieg, fought from 1914 to 1919, with an official peace signed in 1921. The war was waged between the Entente and the Central Powers, as more than 70 million men took part. 10 million died as a result of the Weltkrieg, making it the deadliest conflict in history. Though the word Weltkrieg translated itself into World War, the nation that stood absent was America, whose only involvement was forced when in 1917 an American freighter carrying clothes, food, and toys donated by German-American families for German children for Christmas was torpedoed by a British freighter that mistook it for a German ship. The Americans were outraged, partially stoked by German spies. By that time, the war was already angling towards a loss for the Entente. Though the British had managed some successes over the Ottoman Empire, as they successfully took Baghdad and Jerusalem, their ally France lay crippled as the heavy casualty count resulted in a strike by the French soldiers, discouraging French high command to continue great offensives until the end of that year and giving the Germans a chance to strengthen their grip. That year, Russia, which was fighting in the east but not making good progress, also left the war as the country collapsed into anarchy with the Tsar abdicating in March. A provisional government was formed under Alexander Kerensky, but was overthrown in November by the Bolsheviks, starting the Russian Civil War that lasted until 1920 with a loss for the Bolsheviks, partially due to the assassination of Lenin. Britain was humiliated by the defeat against the Germans, but did not stop there. The year of 1925 would go down in infamy for the Brits, as a British general strike over coal tariffs escalated into a nationwide uprising when government troops slaughtered the striking miners. When the army began to stand down or defect and the Royal Navy began mutiny, the government decided to flee to Canada. A coalition of leftists centered on the Trades Union Congress took control under John Maclean and created the Union of Britain. The collapse of the British government led to massive shifts and land grabs among its overseas possessions. For one, India was broken up into 3 new states, with the Dominion of India still under influence by the Crown in the northwest of the former country. As expected, the poor showing by the British also resulted in provoking moves for independence, like Somalia, where Sultan Mohammed proclaimed his country's independence after portraying Britain as a protectorate facade. In Canada, the country that the British government fled to, the Senate was replaced by a reconstituted House of Lords. King George V was since that day forth seated in the Dominion of Canada. King George hoped to one day reclaim the home islands with the help and the support of the Conservatives. However, R.B. Bennett's Conservatives lost the 1935 election to Mackenzie King's Liberals, who, with a loose coalition of progressives, now held a slim majority in Parliament and sought to assert Canadian parliamentary sovereignty against the growing power of the British exiles and the Crown. This meant that the Crown had potential threats awaiting overseas, but also within their own country borders. By 1936, the Entente consisted of the Dominion of Canada, the West Indies Federation, the French Republic, the Dominion of India, the Australasian Confederation, and Sardinia. As the global economy was declining, more efficient ways of construction and resource gathering needed to be adjusted. King George knew that Canada was not ready yet to put up a fight with the Union of Britain. In fact, he thought it likely that this war would occur beyond his time. But he was a strong believer in research and set forth a path for governmental support to researchers starting with electronic mechanical engineering. Canada's war machine was weak compared to other countries, much to the fact that King George abstained from military development fearing this might hurt the crown's image even more after losing the Krieg against Germany and even losing their own country. Nevertheless, it was time to put some effort into preparing Canada of what was about to come. By 1936, the king's health was deteriorating fast. The doctors who examined him did not see a positive long-term outcome. They estimated he had around 30 days or so more to live. The physicians kept this information from the king. Civilian factories were established over the entire country, but for the moment, Canada lacked a sufficient amount of resources. The three most important alliances globally were the earlier mentioned Entente, the Reichspakt under the lead of Germany, and consisted of multiple countries in Europe, Africa, and Asia, and the Syndicalist International, otherwise known as the Third National, with the Commune of France and the Socialist Republic of Italy as its founding members. Syndicalism was a political ideology that aimed to overthrow capitalism by coordinated actions conducted by industrial workers. The basic political unit of syndicalism was a federation of collectivized trade units, known as the syndicate. It advocates interest aggregation of multiple non-competitive categorized units to negotiate and manage an economy. It holds, on an ethical basis, that all participants in an organized trade internally share equal ownership of its production. Besides the Italians and French, the syndicalists that took control of Britain during the Revolution also joined their faction. Kaiser Wilhelm II was an old man who used to be an image of pride and resilience, but now was losing face as the economy withered away and turmoil was mustering its strength underneath a watchful eye of the public. To still keep his own political efforts strengthened, he tried a move of imperial restructuring. The leader of the Union of Britain, Philip Snowden, was making the first preparations of the 1936 Congress of the Trade Unions. Future plans and the path that Britain would delve into would be determined there. The Commune of France, formerly known as the French Republic, was founded after France had endured a revolution and civil war sparked by the CGT, the General Confederation of Labor. Sébastien Faure told its people that it was headed in the direction of economy, something hopeful for the people as the global economy was falling. It was supposed to create the illusion that France would do things differently. 1936 was immediately thrown into shadow as President Kerensky of Russia had been shot and killed while on the way to the Senate. The assailant was taken down by the police, but the goals and intentions of the attacker were unknown. Despite his massive unpopularity among the Russian people due to botched land reform and ineffective rule, Kerensky was nevertheless able to hold the country together for years, and his death had thrown Russia into chaos. The senators were already discussing a possible replacement to Kerensky. New coalitions were being formed, both between the left and the right, while military men like Denikin, Wrangel, and Korniklov were just one step away from intervening to dissolve democracy and save Mother Russia. Back in 1916, the Act of November 5th resulted in Polish lands occupied by the German Empire being granted autonomy from the collapsing Russian Empire. This came at a price, as the Germans made a concerted effort to colonize a portion of their land known as the Polish frontier strip. In 1936, Poland was a kingdom without a king. The so-called Eternal Regency continued with no clear end in sight, and having both Germany and Austria being involved as they had an opportunity to strengthen the ties through Polish royal house with their influence. The Netherlands, that lay next to Germany under lead of Queen Wilhelmina, was dependent on the German economy, and with its decline, the worries of the Dutch officials rose. The Dutch government set forth a navy plan labeled Vlootplan Helvig that would be the stepping stone towards protecting merchant convoys to increase the Dutch economy by trade with other nations beside those in Europe. Brazil, that had a strong economic relationship with the US during the Weltkrieg, which worsened during 1925, was able to recover its economy slowly since 1927 after revolts and clashes occurred in cities like Sao Paulo. With a focus on urban economy rather than agriculture, Artur da Silva Bernandes set forth the notion of radio broadcasts across the entire nation as a show of progress and unity. The Dominion of India currently headed towards a way of civilian industry. Even though broken up, an increasing research would hopefully quickly establish this part of former India as the industrial dominant one. And then, on the 18th of January 1936, news went public that King George V had passed away. Ever since the Radical Union's victory in Britain, King George had been plagued by illness and his health had been falling. The public was taken by surprise when they heard that the king had died from a bout of fever. Now his son, Prince Edward, was set to inherit the crown. The prince would be known as King Edward VIII and had a huge task hanging on his shoulders. Edward knew that there were those now looking towards him to fulfill his father's wishes of retaking Britain back for the crown. Though this was not made public yet, Edward assured his most inner circle that he would fulfill his father's dying wish for the pride of what once was their Britain. But it would take time and preparation. Though Edward had been groomed to be king, he was not yet ready to take on such a task. He would need to surround himself with strategists and advisors, and allies needed to be gathered. And then, in due time, the Union of Britain would burn. As the Dominion of Canada mourned, in Europe, an important meeting among state leaders occurred. Mussolini, Valois, Beria, and other interested parties arrived in Birmingham to discuss their common ground. It had been agreed that Maximism, Sorelianism, and National Syndicalism all shared basic principles of the state's primary in the socialist struggles. The role of national identity within the state and importance of a strong central authority to preserve and build socialism. The Charter also claimed the socialist state was the final stage of human development and that democracy was not necessary to achieve socialism. These statements had drawn great criticism from other socialist factions, who gave it the name totalism as a play on totalitarian socialism, which had been eagerly accepted by Mosley, who added it to the manifesto's name, attributing it to their total commitment to socialism. But the tales of totalism fell on deaf ears, as in Canada, the new King Edward barely got over the grief of losing his father when he had to write a speech for his coronation. For now, the people mourned as well, and in 28 days, Edward would address the people via radio to encourage them and convince them of a hopeful path that awaited Canada and British citizens that had fled the country. The conservative R.B. Bennett saw an opportunity to strengthen his position in Parliament with the help of the new king, as his current state was weak. But that would all come in due time, as he did not want to press the matter on a grieving son. But even before the coronation, Edward's ruling capability and decision-making were already put to the test as an unexpected visitor associated with Alexander Kolchak arrived. The envoy informed Edward about King George's previous support of Kolchak's 1925 unsuccessful coup in Petrograd. Another humiliation by the infamous year of 25. Still fueled by determination, he assured the king that this time the rogue admiral would triumph. However, he once again requested support from the Entente. None of Edward's advisors opted for a full cooperation, but there were some who could see a potential benefit. Edward was insulted that they came pleading for the support of a coup even before the official coronation had started. It was almost as if he waited for Edward's father to die to seize his opportunity. Edward decided to offer Kolchak only limited support in the form of equipment. No British or Canadian blood would be spilt over this matter. With the coronation of Edward VIII, the government was now prepared to convene the 8th Imperial Conference, which would gather the heads of the governments of Australasia, Delhi, the West Indies Federation, and Canada in Ottawa to discuss the goals and future of the scattered dominions of the British Empire. The invitations were sent out on January the 23rd of 1936. A week later, the government leaders had arrived and the conference was officially underway. It would last for several days. The first day of the conference was meant to portray the layout and the goal of the empire. The Prime Minister of Canada gave a rousing speech, claiming that everyone needed to work to improve and better the dominions of the empire. Edward wisely advised the Prime Minister to keep Syndicalism out of the speech, as it was still too early to showcase Canada's fists to Europe. Following the 1926 German intervention in China and the Treaty of Nanjing signed in November of that year, foreign trade was left to the richest city of the coast, under the joint control of world powers owning interests in China. The independence of these consortium of cities was guaranteed by 8 powers: Australasia, Austria, Canada, Germany, Japan, the French Republic, Russia, and the USA. Foreign investments and the legation cities themselves flourished not only through foreign trade, but also thanks to smuggling into Alg-Ost-Asien and King Imperial territories. Though the global economy seemed to fail, at least Canada still had this at their backs. A few days later, the Indian Empire stood central in the Imperial Conference. The delegate from Delhi delivered a stirring speech about how Canada must aid them in liberating the rest of India from the chains of anarchists and traitorous princes that broke up the crown jewel of the empire. The delegate also spoke for some time on the trade benefits for the Entente if India was united and how it would play a key role in retaking Great Britain from the traitors. Edward agreed. He came to understand that the first target in this future war would not be Britain itself, but crippled countries from the land grab that were the result of the 1925 revolution. Declaring war on the Union of Britain meant declaring war on the Syndicalists, and Edward agreed that he would stand beside India. 2 days later, the delegate of the West Indies Federation spoke about the needs for investing in the various dominions, stressing that the British dominions needed a strong economy in order to take back Great Britain from the anarchist traitors that took control over the country. The earlier mentioned element of a united India would play a crucial role into achieving this. Edward once again assured that he would make this happen. All the while this occurred, the United States of America tumbled into turmoil as different ideologies clashed among its common people, some hinting towards violence. Then on the 1st February Monday of 1936, the Berlin Stock Exchange, that had been constantly sinking, plunged. Fueled by the instability of the market panic, selling erupted as soon as the stock market opened on that Monday morning. It took well into the night for the teleprinters to stop spurting out the results of what became known as Black Monday. When the results had been analyzed, it was clear that the situation had only gotten worse. The shock of this unprecedented economic catastrophe would be felt over the entire world. The German Golden Age had ended for now. Now that several weeks had surpassed, the issue of the 2 large factions within the Canadian political system came to light. One of these factions was led by the Prime Minister, who sought to develop and refine Canada's industrial strength and harvest its resources over foreign policy, and the others led by R.B. Bennett and his supporters in the British diaspora, who wished to mobilize the Canadian economy to launch an invasion of the Union of Britain in the near future, even if that meant accelerating arms production at the expense of civil liberties. Edward could decide not to mingle with any of them, but he assured Bennett that he would get his wish of an invasion, but not at the quick pace as he wanted it. Edward reminded him of the delegate from Delhi, and that Canada's eyes needed to be fixed on India for now. As Edward had sided with the Conservatives, words against the Union of Britain would be mentioned in his speech during the coronation. It was time for the King's first radio address since his father's passing. The King had spoken to the nation and had electrified it. From Vancouver to St. John, from Toronto to the Arctic, Canadians everywhere buzzed with excitement after hearing the charismatic and forceful speech denouncing syndicalism and the king's pledge to one day finish the war that his father began and reclaim Britain. He finished the speech with a sneer towards the Union, as he mentioned that Canadians were to never trust the Union of Britain or its insidious syndicalist allies. Weapon and equipment production was slowly increased despite the lack of certain resources. Possibilities for an invasion of the home islands, dubbed homecoming planning, were created in secret, but Edward mentioned he would not touch those documents until Canada itself and its dominions were more stable. Nevertheless, a watchful eye needed to be kept on the syndicalists in Europe, and so a new head of military intelligence, Henry Kerr, was put in position. With turmoil brewing in the US to the south, Edward first wanted to make the citizens feel secure by starting a path towards the defense of his own realm. This would bring a greater strength to the Canadian Army, Navy, and Air Force. The increasing syndicalist threat in the US was used as the grand motivative factor. In Russia, plans were set in motion to reintroduce Okranka, the Russian secret police organization. The assassination of Kerensky was used as the means to prove this. Some conspiracy theorists believed it were they who organized the assassination on their own president behind the curtains. Besides the Union of Britain, the Commune of France had an important event as well that year. The Commune of France was the world's leading syndicalist nation, united as Federation of City Communes and erected by the Comité de Salut Public, the chief executive. Ever since its inception, however, the Second Commune was not uniform in its policy. Numerous factions arose, each one with their own idea of which France should take. As the time for revenge against Germany and the World Revolution closed in, the CGT election of 1936 was very important. So important, in fact, that none of the four factions could acquire a majority. Much like before the election, a coalition, once again, must be found. On the final day of the Imperial Conference, the 6th of February, the delegate from Australasia spoke of the need for scientific investment. The economy needed modern science in order to keep up the pace and not stagnate, while the military needed the most modern weapons to take back India and Great Britain. Edward remembered that his father was fond of science, and so agreed to delve deeper into Canada's research and development. And then the conference of 1936 was over. The delegates were pleased with how Edward performed. There was hope that perhaps the conference marked the dawn of a new era for the dominions and a strengthening of bonds. But then, on that same day, before the delegates had even returned to their own country, word came out that the Emirate of Afghanistan had declared war on the Dominion of India. War was once again upon the world in the East. After the Weltkrieg, as the British Raj collapsed into turmoil and warfare, the neighboring kingdom of Afghanistan took advantage of this as an opportunity to seize Peshawar and Quetta, both border regions of the Dominion. However, the Afghani government's attempts to modernize over the last decades have been met with fierce resistance from the conservative elements within the country. King Amanullah Khan now hopes to use the turmoil in Delhi following the death of George V to his advantage. By repeating the success of the Fourth Anglo-Afghan War, the king hopes to silence the conservative opposition and bring new lands to the crown. However, international experts did not put many hopes on the tiny mountain nation winning this conflict. Though Canada did not officially declare war on Afghanistan yet, Edward made sure to the delegate of Delhi that they could count on their support. Just like the international experts, the delegate believed this was not to be necessary and that India could clean up this mess on their own. Nevertheless, Canadian troops were marched to the east coastline. As the production line in Canada was resurrected, a new deal with manufacturers needed to be made. Edward chose Canadian Arsenals Limited as their main provider. One of the reasons why the delegate of Delhi advised against Canadian involvement at that moment was due to the official coronation ceremony that occurred 2 days after the declaration of war. The new king was invested with the royal regalia in the First Anglican Church of Ottawa. Jubilant crowds from all over Canada gathered in the cities to celebrate a new age of Canadian royalty. His popularity earned him even before the coronation the nickname Prince of the People. Deutsch Mittelafrika, that was part of the Reichspakt, had to endure the consequences of Black Monday and their direct connection to Germany that was ever falling into despair. To counter this, Hermann von Göring attempted new deals with the Europeans to not only strengthen their political position, which was desperately needed as the people's faith in their leadership was faltering, but also to come out on top with a recovery plan. The consequences of Black Monday could even be felt in South America, in countries like La Plata. But they were already ahead in their startup of a recovery effort. Canada started to make deals with neighboring USA for steel and with the Netherlands for rubber, as the country lacked both resources for the increased demand of weaponry and equipment. Though combat occurred across the front line between India and Afghanistan, the battles were not of a large scale and resembled short skirmishes. Almost 2 weeks after the official coronation of King Edward was over, Sardinia sent a call to arms request, as the participation of Canada could be enough to make the people of Afghanistan drop to their knees and no further blood need to be spilled over this senseless conflict. Though no preparations for troops to embark were made, the man responsible for the troops in case they were sent out had been decided. It was General Claude Auchinleck. 3 weeks after the coronation, the mood in Canada had switched from pleasant to chaotic. The fact that their faction was still in a war with another country, and the economic downfall due to Black Monday that had not been addressed yet by the government resulted in a lot of demonstrations across Canada. Australasia and the French Republic also made it official that they would get involved with the war, but Afghanistan still continued their fight. At the moment, Australasia was putting a council together specifically for research and technology improvement. This coerced with what the delegates said earlier during the Imperial Conference. Then on the 22nd of February, word got out that the Pope had died. All Christendom mourned the death of Pope Pius XI, who died following a heart attack after having been in declining health for the past several years, something which rapidly worsened following Black Monday. The Holy Father would soon be interred with the rest of his predecessors in the tomb of the popes. Until the next pope could be chosen, the papal state would be ruled by the College of Cardinals in Rome. The succession of His Holiness was made all the more important due to the Catholic Church's role in governing the reborn nation, as well as its vehement opposition to Syndicalism, a force which had divided the north of Italy along the River Po and sought to once again reunify the Italian peninsula. As February drew to a close, the war with Afghanistan seemed to waver as well. The forces from Afghanistan only managed to kill 18 Indian soldiers, whereas they lost almost 500. It was, as expected, a very one-sided fight, and it did not last long before a white peace was signed. The reason for this white peace was so that India and Canada could quickly focus on the other pieces of former India that had priority over a country like Afghanistan. It would still take months before action would be taken, but in the meantime, the forces prepared. India did so by expanding its navy. The Princely Federation and the neighboring Bharatya Commune did not sense any danger, as they both focused on industry and development. Bulgaria's Ferdinand I was in the process of setting up an institution of progressive reforms. The sad state of Europe's economy and political situation could give way for that and earn him more political followers, he thought. With the Anglo-Afghan War being over, a new war emerged, as the Emirates of Jabal Shammar declared war on Najd. Both country leaders immediately set forth a program to create a sympathetic outlook from a foreign perspective. By doing this, they hoped to gain war support from other states or countries and ease the process of annexing land once the war would be over. In Australasia, some interesting news regarding the elections arose. The Australasian Confederation had been under the authoritarian rule of Governor-General William Birdwood since the British invocation of emergency protocols in 1924, considered by many in the nation to have been a heavy-handed response to the Melbourne Common Syndicalist uprising. Birdwood finally relented to calls for an open election, leading to the expected result of Stanley Bruce's United Australasia Party achieving a majority government in the Canberra Parliament. Bruce was expected to have a tough time ahead of him, with Labour unrest on the rise, and calls for the revocation of Birdwood's more egregious restrictions on personal liberty. Kolchak had begun his militarization with the help of the Canadian-provided equipment. He was waiting for the right moment to strike. The Treaty of Bucharest of 1918 officially ended the Weltkrieg for Romania, but at what cost? Romania was now dominated by German and Austrian industries. Most of her coastline was annexed by Bulgaria, and the Carpathian Mountains separating Romania from Hungary were put under firm Austro-Hungarian control. The humiliation Romania endured resulted in it devolving into a national populist dictatorship, led by the conjugator Corneliu Codreanu. Codreanu and his Iron Guard set out to restore Romania to what they say it should have been, a titan of the Balkans. Their first major move was a large-scale military exercise, seemingly in preparation to seize the Carpathians, and perhaps the lands beyond. Then on the 13th of March, the Catholic faithful in Rome breathed a sigh of relief as the Sistine Chapel's chimney billowed forth white smoke, signifying the election of a new pope. A short time later, it was announced that the pious and popular Eugenio Cardinal Pacelli had become His Holiness, Pope Pius XII, leader of the Catholic Church and head of state of Rome. To the south of Russia, the countries Mongolia, Maklik, and Tibet were restless. Mongolia was in the process of sending envoys towards Tibet to talk about a possible alliance together. The country Maklik that was in between the two felt pressure of an alliance between both their front and rear border region. Tibet was already in the process of gaining air superiority, and a combined strength between the two might result in a catastrophe for Maklik. Isaac Isaacs, nicknamed the Two Towers, had taken the reins in Australasia for the social conservatives. The socialist aspect had some worried, but he had entered a new political path, that of military expansion. Though his predecessor believed in the importance of science, Isaacs said that he believed the army had priority, as the plan was to take back the dominions and the home islands. Australasia's army and war effort needed to be top-notch in order to do so. Another country that had to deal with the aftermath of Black Monday was of course the neighboring Netherlands. Immediately after completing the Vlootplan Helvig, Wilhelmina greenlit a giant operation to recover from the economic fall. It would take time, but were this program to succeed, then production efficiency, construction, and factory output should all increase, which would result in better stability. At the end of March, representatives from numerous syndicalist and socialist nations had gathered in Paris, in what might just be a defining moment in the history of the ideologies. The French Commune had invited various countries to the first official gathering of the members of the Third Internationale to discuss political, foreign matters and cooperate on spreading socialism further. The French opened the Internationale with a powerful parade, festivities in Paris, and finally a speech by the chairman of the CSP. Topics like Spain, the United States, and the world economic crisis were at the top priority, and it was expected that France and Britain would take initiative in the gathering. But while this occurred, the French Commune mischievously had another agenda. With country leaders gathered and the International Congress as a deceiving curtain, they hoped to strengthen bonds with the purpose of gaining war support, as the words of hatred coming from the West did not go unnoticed. The first steps to bloodshed had been made. With Europe falling into an economic crisis due to Black Monday, people were afraid that Deutsch Mittelafrika would be exploited to counter Germany's economic loss. Göring had a difficult task at hand, as he needed to assure the Kaiser that he could count on his help, but also ensure that his own ruling state would not go bankrupt as well. He aimed at fiscal austerity, which would increase both construction speed and factory output. As a result, Hermann von Göring's political support grew substantially. As King Edward VIII had agreed with the delegate from Australasia to focus more on research, mechanical computing was next on the agenda of researchers that were to be done. This would radically change what sort of machine-assisted calculations could be made. The war between the Emirates fell in the favor of Najd, that was able to dig deep into the territory of their enemy. Jabal Shammar paid in dear blood for their war declaration, as they did not seem able to keep up. The 1936 Stanley Cup came to its finals, creating some much-needed distraction for the stressed-out citizens from multiple countries. The Detroit Red Wings would face off against the Toronto Maple Leafs. The winner would be the 1936 NHL champions and would receive the Stanley Cup. Many people rooted for the Americans, as they hoped a win would cause a temporary depletion in their country's turmoil. Shortly after, Bishop addressed the king and demanded that more money and manpower be spent on modernizing the Air Force. He had a detailed plan, and it seemed like it could work, but would take resources from other projects. Edward dismissed this demand, and said that Canada would remain on its current course following His Majesty's lead. In Mongolia, things were stirring, as preparations were made to make grounded claims on certain territory, arguing it was for the sake of a Mongolian minority in that area. It was something that would clearly be considered an act of war by neighboring Maklik. The Stanley Cup was won by Canada. Toronto had beat Detroit in a 4-game series, bringing the team their 4th victory in the finals. The French Republic's government was in the process of keeping Philippe Pétain situated on their main seat. With the economic crisis and a government in exile, there were radicals and many more who thought they knew how to do a better job of governing a country. But officials were afraid it would throw the French Republic in a time of utter chaos and possibly even civil war. Though the construction of factories could be seen as a marvel of prosperity for a country, King Edward came up with the idea of creating a large highway through its own country. Construction would not change much in the coming years, but means of travel would. The highway would need a proper name once it would be done, something royal and stout, signifying that this road would be like the unbreakable backbone of the country. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm reached out to the youth. The common folk were losing faith in its leaders, and Wilhelm realized he lost connection to some of those affiliated with him for many decades. Thus, he wanted to reform his image to the youth in order to gain more support and manpower were the situation to turn out violent. Then news arrived of a political change. Influential figure in pre-revolutionary Britain's politics and longtime Prime Minister of British government in exile Stanley Baldwin resigned from his mostly ceremonial office after the meeting with His Majesty, in which Edward VIII notified the Prime Minister of his intentions to marry his mistress, Princess Isabel of Orleans. While it is true that the Prime Minister opposed the idea of marriage on the ground of religions of King's love interest, and the fact that His Majesty's father did not agree to his son's marriage with the princess back in 1930 after the death of her first husband, sources close to the royal court indicate that the real reason of resignation lay in the new king ignoring Mr. Baldwin's advice in favor of Winston Churchill and Lord Beaverbrook, formerly ministers in Lord Curzon's government. Edward VIII accepted the resignation, and later that day appointed Lord Beaverbrook as new Prime Minister of government in exile. Then on the 3rd of May, the inevitable clash in the east occurred, as Maklik could no longer sit at the sidelines. The truth was that they were now being portrayed as the bad guy, as Maklik was the nation that declared war first, but the hand they got dealt left them with no other choice. As they feared, they were now at war with both Mongolia and Tibet, meaning a multiple frontline offense would be taken. As this war had just begun, the war between the Emirates was still going on. Najd was still the nation leading in the conflict, but they were not dominating as much as anticipated. The war had already claimed more than 5,000 lives, with Jabal Shammar suffering a startling 4,000. Canada's road to modernization ever so continued, as Edward greenlit concentrated industry at the same time as the build of the first highway. Maklik started out aggressively in their fresh war. They managed to head deeper into both enemy countries' territory. but it came at a high cost. Both Tibet and Mongolia had relative ease to defend and rack up the casualties of neighboring Maklik. And chaos continued to reign in Asia as a revolution in Siam occurred. A successful revolution was achieved by a clique of officers who called themselves Kana Ratsudon, meaning the People's Party. The heir to the throne and the chief of police were placed under arrest, and the king, who was not in Bangkok when the coup was carried out, returned to the capital and accepted the situation he was in. This upheaval in Siam was evidently a political expression of the malaise produced by the pressure of the economic crisis, as they tried to move themselves from absolute monarchy towards self-government. It was unknown whether after securing a parliamentary constitution, the provisional government would prosper or devolve into a dictatorship. After the British Revolution collapsed the American economy, upstate New York and the states east of it reorientated towards Canada to preserve their economies. Too conservative for Syndicalism, but too moderate for America First, New England had become isolated from the rest of the United States and was now effectively in Ottawa's sphere of influence. Joseph Kennedy, representing the political and business elite of the regions, quietly informed everyone today that should the worst come to pass and the government in Washington prove unable to defend them, the state governments would allow Canadian troops to garrison in them. Then, halfway through June, the Trade Union Congress in Britain had finally occurred. It turned out to be decisive. Longtime chairman of the TUC, Philip Snowden, declared his resignation, causing the four major factions in the Union, Maximists, Autonomists, Federationists, and Congregationists, to butt heads over the position. And as the dust settled, Welsh poet and leader of the Autonomists, Nicholas E. Gleis, had been sworn in as the new chairman. The Autonomists supported further decentralization of the Union of Britain and even greater autonomy to the Welsh and Scottish nations, perhaps even full independence. Though there was a lot of opposition to this notion with the common folk, Gleis hoped with his proceedings of Home Rule to establish a grounded base to gain political support over the coming months. The battle between the Emirates was still going on, ever so drenching the sands with blood of both people. And the same occurred in the war with Maklik in Mongolia. Though the front line had not shifted much, the results of attempted assaults were disastrous for Maklik. They had lost over 10,000 men already, whereas Tibet and Mongolia had not even lost a combined number of 1,000 yet. Time and time again were the charges by Maklik stumped by shredding machine gun fire from the heavily defended mountain regions. At the end of June, King Edward VIII officially opened the Queen Mary Way, the limited-access highway connecting Toronto to Niagara Falls via Hamilton. Named for the Queen Mother, the QMW was the first limited-access highway in North America. Next up, King Edward decided that stability needed to be brought back within Canada with the help of a dedicated radio broadcast commission. The CBC, a full-fledged radio network labeled the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, would help bring together a divided nation and limit the influence of potentially subversive foreign broadcasts. Besides stability, it would help King Edward to keep his political support as well. On the construction side of things, Edward greenlit a new excavation program to create better efficiency at gaining resources. At the end of July, the 5th Congress of the Socialist Republic of Italy ended with the Unione Nazionalista of Italy, led by Benito Mussolini, achieving a majority of seats in the government. The changing regime marked a turn of the Republic towards a more hardline and militaristic stance, particularly towards the Republic's enemies in the rest of Italy, who already reacted to the development with alarm. And then, word came out that Poland had elected a new king. For almost 2 decades, the Polish throne had remained empty. After the end of the Weltkrieg, a regency council was convened to elect the new Polish king. However, constant interference and ineptitude had prevented the council from selecting a king for all these years. But now, after many weeks of intense debate inside the chambers of the Polish Regency Council, the decision was finally made to elect a new monarch to the long-vacant Polish throne. The coronation of Karol Olbracht Habsburg-Lothringen, was held in the palace at Warsaw early in the morning, and had been followed by parades and celebration throughout the nation. It remained to be seen whether the new king could navigate the small Polish nation through the coming times. The board was set, and the pieces were moving. It was the calm before the storm. As looming chaos rumbled beneath the sheer fear of the people in various countries, the French Republic in Africa prepared its process to work towards the liberation. Just as Canada, their plan was eventually to take back their home country. When this would happen, a full-scale war against the Internationale would be unleashed, so it was vital that both Canada and the French Republic would be ready for bloodshed by that time. India, that had drawn some attention to itself due to some aggressive stance towards its neighbors, tried to calm things down by focusing on infrastructure and expanding its rail network. The war between the Emirates seemed a forgotten one, mostly due to the clear outcome, though it did not occur as fast as everyone thought. By now, the war had cost 10,000 people their lives. Britain's leader, Nicholas E. Gleis, focused on the Union's navy. With harsh words coming from Canada during the government's speeches, it was pretty clear that the war to retake the islands could be sensed in the distance. But in order to do this, a fierce navy battle would be held, and thus Gleis vowed to keep their fleet in tip-top shape. The recently elected King of Poland, Karol, made it his first intent to stabilize Poland's civilian economy with the build of new factories and better infrastructure in some of the major cities. He was of the opinion that Poland should be healed and built anew from within. Russia's new leader, Nikolai Bukharin, made steps to reform the army according to a plan developed by Denikin. The plan leaned heavily on mass assault charges. With Denikin's influence seeping through in government decision, the country's stability grew due to a stricter military policy overall. In Australasia, Isaac Isaacs drew forth the question of the unions publicly, meaning socialist members and those part of the workers' organizations and trade unions would show their face. A disturbing thought for those fearing a potential syndicalist uprising, but Isaacs had a trick up his sleeve. After the Weltkrieg, Germany seized the former French Indochina, but stability did not restore until German intervention in 1926 crushed the revolutionaries in South China. Now, Indo-Chinese nationalists and leftists under a coalition government called Viet Minh rose up against the colonial regime. Nguyen An Ninh, the head of Viet Minh, declared the independence of Indo-Chinese Union. After salute to the Internationale and World Revolution, he condemned the brutal German oppression of the proletariats of the world and affirmed the Indo-Chinese workers' commitment to anti-imperialism and the liberation of colonial people. Most observers agreed with German media that these were just pompous peasants. German military force or even polices in the Far East would easily suppress the revolts, or so-called Viet Cong. And so Deutsch Ostasien declared war on the Indo-Chinese Union. Helmut von Mucke thought he would quickly disperse of the labeled peasants and would not need help from the fatherland or other allies for that matter. With the Malaya pacification, a whole bunch of land forts and bunkers were erected all over the Asian peninsulas that were under the influence of the Reichspakt. But the Viet Cong were ready for this war. An Ninh had spoken about the German oppressor for a long time, and things went exactly according to plan to where the Germans were the one who declared war first, gaining Ninh's forces much support from citizens. For the first days of the conflict, the Viet Cong were able to take much land for their own. As King Edward had previously started the road towards technological research, he made sure to give full governmental support to the National Research Council. The council was founded during the Weltkrieg to advise the Canadian government on science and research. By providing the organization with additional funding and support, both industrial and military research could be expanded. Then in the beginning of September, the war between the Emirates finally came to an end, with the winner being the expected Najd. The main war in Asia also continued and was a complete mess. Where Ma was able to push itself into Tibet a couple of weeks back, this time it was Tibet pushing into theirs. Forces of Ma clique were spread all over Mongolia, but could not get a proper holdfast. Ma had twice the amount of dead as Mongolia and Tibet. The Indo-Chinese Union continued to take land from the Reichspakt in their neighboring state. Though this fueled their spirits with motivation, the truth of the matter was that a war could never be fully won. If Deutsch Ostasien could not handle it alone, there were many more countries who would send forth its troops. The anti-German speeches by Nin also were heard in the heart of Europe, resulting in the Belgian Declaration of Independence. Sick of German oppression and the disaster of Black Monday, Belgian independence movements throughout the country had been revolting and performing guerrilla strikes on the German army. Due to their own recovery, the German Empire was unable to support Adalbert I to the fullest and has let the situation escalate beyond their control. After coordinated strikes by the independence armies on the city of Mons and Antwerp, they were finally able to push the Flandern Wallonian army back to Brussels, where after fierce fighting, the German king surrendered. With no clear answer yet from the German Empire, many fear that an independent Belgium might be short-lived, especially with tensions between the Empire and the Commune of France rising and the strategic location of the country. And worrying news kept on coming, this time from America. President Herbert Hoover, whose administration had proven to be incapable of stabilizing the divided country and calming down the CSA and AFP militants, had invited General Douglas MacArthur to take the reins of the country with a junta of military men and corporate representatives. President MacArthur was a strong proponent of an iron fist rule and opposed both syndicalism and American pacifism. Large-scale crackdowns on the enemies of America had already been reported. Najd, having annexed Jabal Shammar, now had turned itself onto a Saudi Arabia led by Abdulaziz ibn Saud. Getting the citizens of former Jabal Shammar to swear allegiance to Saud was tough, but in due time, and with the help of a Saudi hegemony, this would eventually come. The fact that the name Najd was disposed helped make some of the citizens feel part of something new. Nicholas E. Gleis now looked outward. Where his previous endeavors focused on benefiting just the Union of Britain, this time, Gleis wanted to portray Britain's position within the Internationale. The government was woven to the fate of that of the French Commune, yet the spirit of the British was different. The nations would stand side by side while prospering, and this granted Gleis more support from his fellow countrymen. In America, it was awfully quiet. MacArthur continued to step down onto his opposers. Many felt they were soon to be pushed to the point of no return, with horrible consequences as a result. But Europe did not care for this. The Kaiser looked at the success that King Edward had with his radio speech and set forth his own political figures to address the people via the radio. By having their voices heard and reaching directly into the homes of the people, Germany's base stability would rise, which was of the utmost importance for a country that was on the brink of collapse. Though the Indo-Chinese Union continued to move upwards, they got countered and flanked by a naval invasion from troops of Deutsch Ostasien from one of the many other islands under their control. With all this war brewing in Asia, the Russian Empire knew it was time to modernize their army. In the beginning of November, Isaac's scheme saw the light, as he began to suppress the syndicalists of his nation. With him questioning the Union previously, syndicalists members dared to show their face, making them easy targets for censorship and silencing them. Isaacs directed the government in the exact direction he wanted to. After Edward had finished his political path towards better research, it was time to continue and finish the infrastructural side of things. Besides the Queen Mary Way, a proper rail expansion was in order as well. Then halfway through November, word got out of the elections in Italy. The election within the Republic of Italy had resulted in the election of Prime Minister Gabriele D'Annunzio, head of the Associazione Nazionalista Italiana. The new Prime Minister had quickly discarded the title of Prime Minister for the title of Il Duce, which he said was much more fitting for Italia. In a speech in Milan, he had stated that nothing shall ever stand in the way of Italy's greatness, and that the present Black Monday crisis was due to vile Austrian influence, which would eventually be destroyed by the new legions of Italy. And then, by the end of 1936, some astounding news arrived. A new war seemed to have broken out, but not in Asia, but on American soil. The government received a transmission that the so-called Combined Syndicates of America had declared war on the labeled American Union state, and at the same time, the United States declared war on both these factions. Though this came to a surprise to some, to others, it was a war that was years in the making and had finally been unleashed. The Second American Civil War was about to begin. The Civil War in America had been upon the world for a little over 2 months. At some locations, the combined syndicates and the Union state had met one another and did their greeting in blood. Much like MacArthur's troops before, the Syndicalists were not able to overthrow the Union state's defensive forts and suffered heavy casualties because of it. But at the same time, it were those trying to defend their beloved free United States of America who bled the most. 32,000 men and women had already died by fellow Americans who they used to call brothers back in the day. In Canada, all eyes were fixed on its government, which were in the process of creating the so-called Bill C-7. The first proposal on the matter concerned Canada's industry. When the Great War began, the British Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, said that industry would proceed as business as usual. The ensuing shell crisis and the difficulty found in equipping the British Army showed that if another war were to start, Canada would need a mobilized war economy. However, most businessmen were not willing to invest in specialized facilities such as heavy bomber factories that such an economy would require. Some conservative MPs were proposing that part of the security bill would include a provision to immediately nationalize such key war industries. While this would not increase the size of Canada's industrial capacity, it would cut down on a lot of red tape. C.D. Howe. Conscription was deeply unpopular, especially in Quebec. The Prime Minister had declared conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. Edward was faced with a dilemma. A conscription bill could reassure an army for Canada in case they would go to war, something that would not happen for at least another half year. But being well prepared could be a decisive strategy when the time would come. More importantly for the moment was Canada's declining stability, and with the threat of the Progressives to leave, Edward automatically was steered towards declining the conscription. On the bright side, this would increase much needed stability, and the positive consequences could already be felt within the next week. The issue of Canada's domestic security also saw the light. Canada had been able to avoid the bitter class war that engulfed Britain after the Weltkrieg, but conflict between Anglo-Canadians and British exiles was growing. Some of this had led to the development of several groups calling for rapprochement with the Union of Britain. The Tories wanted to crack down on these groups and proposed that a new parliamentary committee be formed with executive power over the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and a new civilian intelligence agency with Conservative MP Robert Magnon as its chairman. Such a committee would be the first of its kind in Canada and would cut back on many civil liberties and union rights. Ernest Lapointe, the Solicitor General, had suggested that some symbolic laws be passed to bring some of the Tories on the side, and a weaker committee be created with Louis Saint Laurent as its chairman, while the Progressives were adamant that no infringement of their civil rights took place. The last thing Edward wanted was, after having steered into a positive direction concerning stability, to create a secret police that would make some of its citizens feel conflicted with their civil rights and freedom. Edward refused the proposal. As the bill was being finalized, the sad news arrived that Gilbert K. Chesterton had passed away in his exile in Ottawa at 62 years of age. A prolific author, whose most known novel was certainly The Man Who Was Thursday. He was a devout Roman Catholic and a Christian apologist, two reasons that forced him to leave England to avoid persecution after the Syndicalist Revolution. As he was so beloved, Canada's radio broadcasts all focused on his passing for the next 2 days, giving the citizens time and room to grieve, but also to think about something else than the civil war happening south of them. War seemed to once more favor Asia, as the Republic of Korea had taken hold and declared war on the Empire of Japan. Japan would not stand for this, and would attack it from all sides, using its bulking navy as a battering ram to squash them like bugs. Hirohito lashed out hard towards the Koreans, and even vowed that Japanese allies would join the war, meaning that Korea could never stand a chance, and its followers fell victim to following illusions. In preparation for the Japanese navy, the Korean leader Yi-eun initialized modernization of the dockyards, including better defenses and coastal forts. The harbor city of Busan would be one of the places coming under heavy fire, but as long as the Koreans could hold this and refrain the Japanese from setting foot on their soil, hopes of winning this war would not go lost. To the west of this conflict, the long-brewing Mongolian War still raged on, with opposing Ma clique standing on its last legs. It could no longer win, but the real question was, how many more needed to die before capitulation? And as this all occurred, the war in America continued, claiming lives and creating widows and single mothers every day. When finally in the second half of February, the news arrived that Mexico had indeed declared war, but not on the US, but on the Pacific states to the west. MacArthur sighed of relief when he found out about this, and could continue to focus on the Union and the Syndicalists. With war happening all around, it fueled frustrated spirits in various countries and also unleashed the Romanian Civil War. After the disastrous defeat in the Weltkrieg, the days of the Romanian monarchy were counted. After the death of King Ferdinand I in 1927, the crown went to his grandson Michael, who was soon forced to abdicate and was replaced by a military dictatorship. The autocracy was soon replaced by the nigh totalitarian rule of the Iron Guard. However, many people in Romania, most notably intellectuals, remained sympathetic to the monarchists, especially Ferdinand I's disgraced son Carol. A group of pro-monarchist officers had defected and seized control of Bessarabia and Moldavia as a stage of operations for a monarchist restoration in the country. Romania now fell into a bloody civil war that would rage on for a very long time. Coldrenu was prepared for this war. He had started to move towards a militaristic approach many months before, with currently wrapping up his initiated armor effort. Those with a monarchist favor had been launched into modern warfare by Carol, which many hoped would jumpstart them to a position to win over the Iron Guard's forces. In America, Washington was still standing, its soldiers among some of the bravest, repelling attempt after attempt from the traitors. In the West, the US was losing territory to the Union state, but at the same time, Mexico had begun invading the Pacific states. The invasion went slow, which mainly was caused by a narrow front line, making it easy to defend. Frank Merriam, for the moment, was not worried yet, and thought this was an opportunity for the Pacific states to show its worth and power. In Britain, Nicholas E. Gleis continued the forecasted route of making both Scotland and Wales puppeted states, with each government implemented by the Union of Britain in favor of the Internationale. The Romanian Civil War continued in the favor of Coldrenu, much to his anticipated plan of action. The Civil War in America had now been going on for more than 3 months, and the soldiers stationed around Washington even managed to win some territory back by expanding to the south. These brave men were giving the name Washington's Hope, as their actions gave hope to those still rooting for a US victory. Then news came from Europe that did not involve a war. Since the end of the Austrian occupation during the 1920s, Serbia had officially been a kingdom. They never dared to crown a king, as they were forced to keep a low profile in the light of further Austrian aggression. Petar Bojovic, the regent of Serbia for almost 2 decades and a known royalist, had now decided to restore the monarchy. Alexander II, the son of former King Peter I, had accepted the crown and was today crowned as King of Serbia. This controversial move would likely upset the Austrian and Bulgarian governments. In Asia, Korea was coming down hard on the Japanese, despite Hirohito's heated words. They managed to pull in territory in the north and killed almost 20,000 Japanese, whereas they lost 8,000, a number that was still significant considering their size compared to Japan. By this time, the Civil War in America had turned into a real bloodbath, with the US casualties coming near an astonishing 200,000 at both fronts. The men of Washington's hope were once again pushed back up north, but would not give up so easily, and another push south was already in preparation. With Mexico not being able to push the pace in the war with the Pacific states, Toledano started to invest in infantry for a more powerful army to hopefully create a breakthrough. By the end of March, Wales and Scotland were finally let go in unions for both states. When it came to the Welsh Union, Gleis, who originated from that area, started with immediate political reforms as he wanted to push the importance of this area. He wanted a stoic political system, creating a government that would stand with the Third Internationale and would surely never capitulate. For the Union of Scotland, he had other plans, as he wanted to focus on industry in this region. Back in America, Russian troops had been seen along the Canadian border, arriving to fight for the Syndicalist movement. Then on April 1st, the final draft of Bill C-7 was finally accepted and passed by the House of Lords, albeit after some individual members received rewards and bargaining money in return for their affirmative vote. With the bill passed, the next topic of discussion was of course once again an intervention in the Civil War and possibly coming to the aid of the US. But as before, politics kept getting in the way, as with the current state of Canada's government, this could not be done. Either a Constitution Act needed to be set in stone, or the opposition had to be purged. The fraud process with the House of Lords on passing Bill C-7 was used as the motivation regarding information to the public. The time had come to formalize a constitution for the nation and clearly define the role of the Prime Minister, Parliament, and the Crown in a full independent and democratic Canada. In the war between Korea and Japan, the tide had finally turned and Japan had set foot on Korean soil. This was a death sentence for Korea, as now troops and equipment could be easily transported to the taken harbors. In America, things were looking dire for the United States, that only had a small amount of land left. By now, they were no longer in control of most land in the country. By April 11th, the word came out that Ma had finally lost the war to both Tibet and Mongolia, and the latter had a huge increase in land control and overall power. The very next day, news arrived from Africa. After a brief French civil war, the old government of France and its supporters fled to North Africa to escape Syndicalist wrath. There, the nation eventually devolved into a military junta under the line of Verdun Philippe Pétain. However, a big question arose in this defeated nation: what should the future be? Retaking France was the priority, yes, but what should be the government? It appeared that the French had answered the question themselves though, as the national French state had accepted an agreement to restore the monarchy in France. Romania was still intertwined in a civil war, and though the kingdom seemed to falter all throughout the war, the Iron Guard was just not able to close the deal and seal it. Whereas Japan did much better in raining down hell on the Korean traders, leaving nothing but death and destruction in their wake. Canada, for the moment, was working on their fleet battle plan, as backup needed to be formed in case the Syndicalists would take over the entire US and Union state. And even by April 25th, the soldiers in Washington still continued fighting, many men having gotten used to waking up in hell each morning they survived. By now the clash between the Syndicalists and the Union also took on staggering proportions, as almost a combined number of 150,000 soldiers had died. Then Japan finally handed out the death blow and drove the Koreans into the sea, as their empire now stood stronger than ever. It was a display of power for a country that came out victorious despite suffering heavy losses. The first Syndicalist International, held in Paris, dealt with spreading the ideology overseas, supporting syndicalist movements and strengthening the ties between existing syndicalist nations. And thanks to the gathering success, the Second Internationale had been called to be held in London. Representatives from the entire world were greeted by a British artillery salute, a Scottish bagpipe chorus, and an overall warm reception. As Europe rolled closer and closer to war, military and economic cooperation between the syndicalists was expected to be the primary topic of discussion, and France and Britain would once again call the shots on the International's policy. In America, the CSA was about to reach the border of the Pacific states, meaning a large piece of US-controlled territory would be cut off and left to their fate. This would be devastating for the United States, who grew desperate, and in that desperation, Washington's hope once more showcased the world of its mindset as they mowed their way down south along the coast. It was a message to the world signaling, "We are still here, even if our fellow brothers to the west are slowly dying." For Canada, a bit of morbid yet good news arrived in the form that the death of Philip Snowden was announced. He passed away in his house in Tilford, Surrey at the age of 73. The traitor and the chairman of the Union of Britain's TUC, Snowden had been remembered among the royalists as a synonym of treachery. Although the socialists in Britain mourned his death, in Canada his funeral had become a single bright day in this dark period of history. Much to the relief of Canada's government, Snowden's passing actually increased stability in the country. And in Romania, the civil war was nowhere near ending, even though the kingdom had lost more than 25% of its army already in the form of 31,000 dead. But their soldiers were loyal, which played a huge part in why they were still able to hold out against the Iron Guard. At the end of May, terrible news arrived regarding the progress syndicalists were having worldwide. Chaotic reports were coming from the small mountain republic of Switzerland, stating that syndicalist revolutionaries had seized the western regions following a Swiss military crackdown in various areas. Supporting the successful Swiss revolutionaries, French troops quickly moved in to occupy the region, and the Swiss military held a defensive posture, unwilling to advance into the French guns. It seemed that the speed of the revolutionary action caught the Swiss government off guard, and they were unwilling to escalate the violence into a full war with France. It remained to be seen what the Swiss would do next, but this movement could fuel syndicalist revolutionaries in other countries as well. 1937 seemed to be the year of civil wars, and things escalated at an alarming rate ever since the Civil War occurred at the end of the year before. Ever since the defeat of Napoleon, Spain had been plagued by violence, dissent, and turmoil. But it appeared that these tensions had reached its breaking point. That is, the Spanish kingdom had been ripped apart in a three-sided civil war between the numerous factions: the loyalists of the Madrid government, the supporters of the pretender Javier, and finally, the anarcho-syndicalist party. There were already numerous reports of volunteers and equipment being shipped to Spain from all over the world to support one faction or another, mimicking the occurrences in America. And things did not end there. On the 30th of May, the Austrian Empire declared war on the Kingdom of Hungary, descending the world into chaos even more. But all these terrible acts of war never reached the ears of the Americans, as they had to deal with their own chaos and hell on earth. The US was on its last legs. MacArthur had little to no hope left, unlike his soldiers in Washington that fought, bled, and died for their country's ideology. In their eyes, true heroes died and got buried at that entire front. As if the world wasn't tortured by enough war already, the news went public that the Socialist Republic of Italy had declared war on the two Sicilies. America endured a civil war that roared on for many months, and MacArthur's troops were fighting a losing battle. Not too long after, the Legionnaire Italy saw an opportunity to declare war on the Socialist Republic under the motto, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Spain was also divided and shattered in a three-way civil war that for the moment continued equally amongst the three factions. With the US Civil War now continuing for over half a year, Canada's political bureaucracy was finally ready to set Defense Scheme 2 into motion. The plan was originally created for a scenario where America was attacked and invaded from the outside. With a full-blown war now dominating from the inside, experts believe that Scheme 2 could be updated to benefit in this current environment. The US forces fighting in the west of the country had been cut off once before, and now had been cut off a second time, quickening the destruction of their held positions everywhere. But the soldiers labeled Washington's Hope were battle-hardened soldiers fighting for a cause each of them believed in. Several thousand troops were enough to still kindle hope in a situation that seemed hopeless. Then word got out regarding the wars in Europe. The Habsburg capital was lost. The Hungarian army pinned the remaining Austrian soldiers on the banks of the Danube. And rumor had it that the Austrian royal family fled while they could. Now the city was completely controlled by Hungary, its many artists and musicians living in apprehension of what would become this cultural bastion of Europe. Hungary was planning a great military parade around the Ringstrasse in celebration of this massive military feat, and the Hungarian general in charge of the occupation was going to address citizens from the balcony of the Neue Burg to try to ease the worries of a population worn by weeks of fighting. In Spain, that had a stalemate between the three factions for the longest time, things now hinted towards a breakage of the Carlist Spain faction. The countries part of the Entente, besides Canada, were assigned a new task. With King Edward now being forced to shift his attention to the US Civil War, the preparations for the war to retake both France and Britain needed to be done by the others. King John III saw to it himself to guide the reinforcing of the Entente's power. Then some surprising news arrived from Asia. It had recently come to light that the mad Baron of Mongolia, Roman Ungarn von Sternberg, had risen to new heights and declared himself to be the successor to Genghis Khan, appropriately named Ungarn Khan. It was not known what this change would entail though. The Mongolian army had already defeated the Maklik, and von Sternberg had declared his right to reign over all Mongolians numerous times before. Experts denied the possibility that the Mongolians could pose a threat to the established powers in the Far East, but the fresh Khan's ambitions could only grow higher. In Romania, the civil war had also been entangled in a stalemate, with Cotronu on the doorstep of the loyalists of the monarch. In America, the civil war now concerned mostly the Union State and the Syndicalists, with the CSA having an advantage in terms of controlled landmass. In Britain, Gleis was in the process of improving relations with contacts and representatives in Australasia. After the questioning of the unions by Australasia's two towers, Gleis figured a spreading of influence could slow the Entente down as the Third International's strength grew in Europe. And Europe was rapidly delving into utter chaos. It was only a matter of time before the German Empire would be thrown into the conflict as well, and the Kaiser was in the process to reform Mitteleuropa. The Kaiser's allies in Deutsch-Mittelafrika were currently improving infrastructure via the Cape to Cairo Railway. In America, the US forces only had a sliver left on the Western Front, and it did not take long before those soldiers got crushed and executed in cold blood. Washington's hope still held out, completely cut off from the rest of the country and baptized by blood and fire. In Romania, Cotronu hoped that with the purchase of new infantry weapons, a breakthrough could be made in the civil war. Both factions had lost many of their troops, and the war seemingly would not end anytime soon. Then a public statement arose on Russia's ambitions. While many still viewed Russia as a failed state, torn apart by revolts, disorder, and ineffective rule, and serving as a buffer for the Reichspakt, recent events had proven something different. The government of the Russian nation had announced their territorial ambitions, laying claims on almost all the territory of the former Russian Empire. And it appeared they were willing to reconquer the lost land if necessary. Numerous nations in Eastern Europe had already recalled their embassies in Russia, and the world was waiting for Germany's response to this blatant attack on her sphere of influence. In America, Washington's hope was able, even after suffering setback after setback, of still pulling off expanding attacks land inward, though these were usually short-lived. Europe was in utter misery. It was destroyed in multiple countries, at multiple fronts. News on the movement in the Spanish Civil War was announced. It was confirmed that the Carlist temporary capital, Burgos, had been captured by advancing anarcho-Spanish troops after skirmishes in the hilly countryside. Carlist forces put off stiff resistance, hoping to delay the enemy forces, but were eventually beaten back. Castilians fled north to the Basque coast, tearfully describing seeing their homeland burning, and syndicalist soldiers even committing atrocities on their own people. Rumors stated King Javier was escorted out with the flow of refugees by Carlist militia, but his destination remained unknown. Many hoped Carlist Spain might continue, was completely locked down. Papal soldiers had been seen dispersing into the low foothills surrounding the ancient capital of the Roman Empire. The Socialist Republic of Italy had been careful to announce that special military police were on hand in the city to prevent the looting of the Pantheon, and they were in negotiation with the Pope to see what autonomy the Vatican could retain while under Italian occupation. The war between the Austrian Empire and Hungary had shifted tone, as the Austrians were able to secure more enemy territory as of recent. And in Spain, the civil war was nowhere near ending, but it did draw near for those affiliated with Carlist Spain. Washington's hope now attempted an attack up north, most likely to link up with the Canadian borders to establish better communications and easier access for supplies regarding the land lease. As the leader of the Baharaches Commune's faction of moderates and his recently elected head of state, A.K. Fazlul Huk, gave a fiery speech to an electrified crowd in Calcutta, promising that his new syndicalist government would usher in an era of prosperity and industrial growth for the nation. He dismissed any notions that this might mean a more conciliatory approach towards the dominion of India to the north and the princely federation to the west, saying that the Commune would do whatever it took to spread the workers' revolution across the Indian subcontinent and the rest of the world. His election was interpreted in many corners as an indication of closer relations with syndicalist nations elsewhere, and some were speculating whether this might mean entry for the Baharacha Commune into the Commune of France's Internationale faction. As Europe continued to eat away at itself, the conflict in Italy drew to a close. The Socialist Republic of Italy stood victorious, claiming land, and now only had to deal with minor factions up north. And at the end of September, the Austrian Empire remained standing as the dust settled after the war with neighboring Hungary. The assault up north by Washington's hope was put down hard, but the soldiers refrained from surrendering. They would not be able to win this war by themselves, and the real question was if Canada could get the bureaucracy through quick enough to save what was left. War was everywhere. As America and Central Europe were tearing at each other's throats, Russia was next, after announcing their ambitions earlier. The war declaration on Alash Orda became official as blood would flow here as well. Socialist Republic of Italy, that dominated against the factions to the south, unsurprisingly, had little trouble with their enemies to the north to secure a full autonomy. Benito Mussolini now could enjoy some peace and quiet, though the knives were sharpened at the borders. He instated commissars with the purpose of spreading his influence and ideology to gain stability across the entire country that had been divided up in many different factions for the last decades. Then some good news for Washington's hope arrived for the first in a long time. Federal forces had been pushing towards the American Union State's temporary capital of Atlanta for a while. Reports were coming in of the city's imminent capture by advancing US troops. Huey Long's current whereabouts were unknown, but it was believed he was rapidly evacuated to the countryside. Reports indicated that military police had begun rounding up Union representatives and Minutemen en masse, and that fires were now spreading unchecked through the city as the Federal Army was focused on restoring order. The US soldiers were able to cut off a chunk of landmass held by the Union state, but though it was ripe for the taking, they lacked the amount of troops to hold such an increased size of territory this quickly. Alash Orda stood no chance to the might of Russia, showcasing to the world that all doubt in their powers was for naught. Though there were many wars on the different continents, the one war that was often forgotten about was the one between the Pacific states and Mexico. With each passing week, Mexico crept closer to the north. Then a year after the Civil War had begun, Canada's bureaucratic steps towards assembling a pact with the USA had been completed and could now be set in motion within the next 2 months. A treaty of non-aggression, military access, and exclusive trading rights were on the agenda. If the pact was accepted by Washington, it still meant Canada was not part of the conflict, but then it would only be a matter of days before that could occur. The Austrian-Hungarian War had ended in a white peace, with each faction retaining territory while keeping each other in check with mistrusting eyes. The resurgence of the Mongols, announced earlier with the rise of the power of Ungern Khan, continued as they declared war on Tibet, their ally during the war against Maklik. In Canada, about 1,000 volunteers were on their way towards Washington the moment it was announced that a treaty with Washington was in progress. They would not attack the opposing factions, but merely relieve and resupply the US troops in the capital and preventing it from falling into enemy hands. Though the US troops did try to take the cut-off area from the Union state, as expected, they did not have enough men to hold the line, and a few hundred troops got separated and mowed down in an act of vengeance for the fall of Atlanta. A second army, between 30 and 40,000 strong, came under the command of General Alan Brooke. They were sent all across the wide border to the south opposite of the American Syndicalists. With Russia dominating in their first conflict, their next conflict would also not prove any difficulty, as Russia's foreboding wrath could be felt throughout the West. The Ottoman Empire, part of a theater not in the spotlights of Canadian intelligence due to lack of technology, had announced publicly to the world that it got into a war with the Sultanate of Egypt. With negotiations being underway between Canada and Washington, intelligence on the US troops' position and the situation of the war came to light as well, proving how dire things were. The 1,000 troops arrived in Washington, bringing ammunition and weapons, but more importantly, food, smokes, and friendly human contact from the outside. Many US troops could finally sleep a bit better knowing that the Canadian and British volunteers had their backs. 2 more factions got involved in the war regarding the Ottoman Empire, threatening conflicts to spark all the way down Africa. A cluster of smaller factions got entangled, biting off more than they could chew, though the Ottomans were facing multiple enemies all at the same time neighboring their border. Fighting in America was fierce. The Syndicalists tried their best day in and day out to breach through to the capital to make the remaining US fall. The horrors of the war were written and sent to loving wives and worried mothers by the soldiers stationed in the capital. And then the German Empire finally got into a war as well, as they headed into Belgium to the west. After the end of the Weltkrieg, with the signing of the Peace of Honor, and even more so after the Revolution in 1925, Britain and Portugal had drifted further and further apart despite remaining in a formal alliance. But as dangerous times began to threaten Europe and the time to reclaim the birthright was fast approaching, Portugal asked the king for support and would in turn provide support during the fast approaching Second Weltkrieg. And with that, Portugal had joined the Entente. The Dominion of India got war declared by Nepal that had set its borders in stone, expecting to make a ruckus with this reckless move. India assured the king that no reinforcements would be necessary. The Ottoman Empire was being devoured rapidly as multiple nations threw themselves onto them without mercy or remorse. Though Nepal in the initial days of the war was able to leash out and win some territory for their gain, it became clear that it would slow down rapidly and turn against their favor soon. As Russia was still involved in a war to the west, their victory over Alash Orda motivated troops to keep heading south, and eventually they declared war on Turkestan as well. Then on the 21st of January 1938, the negotiations and conclusion sealing the pact with the United States had finally rounded up. The United States had officially ratified the Pact of Non-Aggression and Cooperation. All trade with the rebellious Union State and combined syndicates had been cut off. The next step would be important, because this would finally embed Canada, and therefore the Entente intervening and getting involved in the war. However, this would still take more than 80 days to realize. With rumors spreading throughout the country of Canada's involvement, both the Union State and the CSA double-timed on their efforts to overthrow the remaining US soldiers. The Germans in Central Europe were heading into Belgium. Casualties were high, due to their overwhelming number being neglected due to the narrow borderline. The Ottoman Empire struck back at its enemies via air invasions and flanking maneuvers to create chaos from within. With Canada making preparations to get involved with the war, the 1,000 troops in Washington headed out to meet the Syndicalists head-on to slow down their approach. They were not enough to make a difference, but could stall them at various locations. Then halfway through February, the Iron Guard stood victorious over the Romanian monarch. Coudronu had quite a task ahead of him of repairing the damage that arose from the Civil War. His factory effort was the first step of creating some harmony in a devastated country again. With the CSA attack from the north successfully stalled, the Canadian volunteers now headed west as a ferocious assault by the Syndicalists had put them closer to the borders of Washington. Serbia, Romania, and Greece, the three Balkan members of the Entente, each with views of their own, had recently gathered to a common table of negotiations and had announced the beginning of the Belgrade Pact. While this pact would put a lot of focus on cultural discussion and preserving the Balkan identities, it was also a military alliance between the participants, seemingly directed at the countries separating them and holding their ancestral lands. This development was a big thorn in Bulgarian domination of the Balkans. In the first week of March, German forces had moved all the way to the coast, now having surrounded the few remaining Belgian troops who opposed. The Mongolian attack on Tibet bared fruit as they achieved an easy victory and had turned into one of the most powerful nations in Asia. Their neighboring Russia had achieved a victory as well, gaining excessive land to their gain, which in their eyes was theirs by right to begin with. The civil war in Spain still continued, and though shifting every other week, still remained fairly even for all three factions. In America, the Syndicalists were coming from everywhere, but were just not able to breach through, though the US defenses were on the verge of giving in. It would take less than 30 days for a war declaration to be prepared, and an addition of the Entente could be disastrous for the CSA. Though Canada had one flaw, which was their wide front line that they could not protect at all places. It was their own Achilles heel, but Canada hoped for troops to arrive from other Entente countries to come to their aid. Soon blood would flow across the entire Canadian border. A country was reborn in the Balkans after the Weltkrieg, Greater Bulgaria, the Titan of the peninsula, uniting all Bulgarian lands and beyond. This kingdom for all Bulgarians was born with bloodshed and war, though defeating Serbia, Greece, and Romania in the Weltkrieg, a move that these three nations were still bitter about. This tension led to the formation of the Belgrade Pact, and this alliance of the Balkan states had now declared war on the Tsardom, throwing this region into conflict yet again. In Canada, war was on everyone's mind. It would still be a minor 2 weeks before the war declaration could be fulfilled, and troops were being sent out overseas and towards the border regions. Reserves were used to fill up the gap in the middle, but they were under-equipped as Canada struggled to produce enough weapons and equipment due to the appointed land lease with the US. And the blood continued to flow at the front lines between the CSA and the US troops. Even if Canada would join the war, they would still be opposing a formidable foe that had conquered and claimed many factories and territories over the past year. In Europe, things continued in the same cynical sense as neighbors were at each other's throat, which also counted for countries in the Middle East. With equipment sent by other countries overseas, the US soldiers were able to drive the Union state out as the Syndicalists eradicated them from the west flank. It would not be long before this conflict would revolve solely about the CSA and the USA. Battle plans were set up by several generals to move towards the Midwest in a sweeping motion in order to first link up with their US neighbors to combine strengths. Australasia would arrive at the West Point and protect their flank. By the 10th of April, most of the gaps had been closed, but there were not nearly enough men to hold the entire border. Most troops were inexperienced and low on ammunition and supplies. The country was 2 days away from war. Everyone could feel the tension in the air. Loved ones held each other tight one last time, and in schools and public community centers, exercises were held on what to do if Canada and their hometown would be invaded. They barely got any word on the situation in Europe, with the Balkan War claiming lives every day with all factions. And so, on the 14th of April, 1938, it began. Canada officially declared war on the Syndicalists to the south. With this, a whole bunch of actions and operations were undertaken in the same day. The authorization was given for a priority build of 10 new factories across the country to support the boys at the front. The Canadians would face 500,000 Syndicalist soldiers, but luckily, the Canadians did not stand alone. Though the USA was not officially an ally, the approved military access and similar goal sure made the two factions feel like allies. More importantly, all countries part of the Entente would be called in to aid in the war effort. On that same day, the first of the bombers were sent out to bomb enemy factories, to cripple their infrastructure. On that same day, fighters were traversing the skies, looking to support the soldiers moving down south and mowing down their nemesis wherever they could. And on that day, the Canadian fleet was sent out too. Though the CSA did not own a large navy, it did have a few ships that could hinder the arrival and traversal of Entente allies, and thus they would be dealt with soon. The honor of the Entente held strong, as all who received the message to aid in the war agreed to do so. And so on that day, the first of the infantry stepped over the American border and headed south without running into any resistance. Entente allies agreed to provide equipment and weapons for the Canadians as the production capabilities were low, despite an altered deal with the Americans. During the first 3 days of marching, no battles were fought except for on the sea and in the air. Morale on the men rose, especially in the west, where the unsupplied troops retook the first territories. They were welcomed by the citizens stuck under a cruel regime, and the Americans handed gifts and food to the soldiers to show their thanks. By April 18th, Germany had claimed a victory over Belgium that stood no chance to begin with. On the seas, the Canadian ships battled it out with the few that the Syndicalists possessed. The Canadians dominated the sea, sinking vessel after vessel. On the fourth day, resistance was first met by the ground troops to the east. Those first conflicts were often small skirmishes, ending up in the favor of the Canadians. This was mostly due to the fact that the CSA troops headed there were sent as an emergency procedure to slow the Canadians down rather than to counter them. News then arrived from Europe. The Serbian government had gone into exile, and their main forces capitulated to the Austrian Empire, who was now in control of their home area. The struggles between the Austrian Empire and the Kingdom of Serbia was only a small part of the conflict. But on the 21st of April, Bulgaria took the majority of claimed land, though promising to reinstate certain governments in their favor of returning the borders of the Balkan states in due time. The war with Canada and the Syndicalists was now going on for over a week without little to fear for the Canadians. The combined front of the US and their troops was still far apart, but the knowledge that Allied troops of the Entente were on their way as well made them fear nothing. It even went so smooth that television and papers had room for news on a smaller scale, including the unfortunate death of Billy Bishop. He was a Canadian fighter ace and local hero who was killed in an accident when his plane collided with another plane over the airfield in Regina. The broad front line to the west had now almost entirely shifted southward, without any form of resistance being shown. A proof that the American landscape was so big that it was not possible for the CSA to send troops over there in time before losing some precious territory. The war by the claimed territories provided to them. If Syndicalist Mexico would eventually get involved in the war to their north as well, it could have disastrous consequences. The American soldiers had trouble heading north, as many attempts were cut off at the route, and hundreds of soldiers sometimes were left to their fate despite their noble attempts. Though the Canadians had to deal with some setbacks, and the first of the dead arrived back from the front, spirits were still optimistic, and the local news had time to mourn another war hero. General Edmund Allenby died in his exile at Ottawa, aged 75. Retired since 1925, he was mostly known as the Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Forces in the Middle East. After achieving major victories thanks to the Arab help, such as taking Jerusalem, he was forced to withdraw as the Weltkrieg went bad for England. By honoring him with the state funerals, King Edward wanted to show his desire for revenge. Halfway through May, word got out that many Portuguese ships had now been sighted in American waters to help secure the convoy routes and also provide men to help fight the war. The papers hailed their Portuguese allies for the quick arrival. But then, a week later, hopes and smiles were crushed as the terrible news arrived that Washington, the city that was protected and had to endure for so many months, had fallen. Syndicate militias had advanced towards and captured the symbolic capital of the United States. They stormed the Capitol building and met strong resistance, but eventually they broke through the troops of Washington's hope, and the flag of the Combined Syndicates of America now flew over this US Capitol. Rumors were that syndicate militias had been rounding up all political representatives they could find in the city to give them trial, although unconfirmed sources claimed that the most important government figures have been evacuated during the battle, with their current whereabouts unknown. This was a devastating blow for the US, but also Canada, that had just recently got involved. Though the US was able to win some territory back over the past months, this symbolic defeat would weigh dearly on its troops. Skeptics were afraid that the battles were for naught, and that soon Canada would have to face the CSA by herself after all. It was the 17th of May, 1938, and as the world's eyes were fixated on the American war that now involved Canada, Mittelafrika had collapsed. Disturbing reports emerged out of various parts of Africa that were under German rule. It seemed that the Mittelafrican administration had disintegrated completely. It was unclear why or how, but the under-equipped soldiers from Canada and Britain were dealing with low morale syndicalist troops tired and exhausted from the weeks of traveling through the American countryside to reach the invaders. As Canada was being halted at several locations on the field, multiple military staff had their own suggestions to bring to the Prime Minister. One of these was Wilfred Curtis, who proposed a new plan to further the expansion of the Air Force. It was even more ambitious than the plans of Bishop and would call for great reform. The problem with the proposal was that it recommended that this be a Canada First endeavor and called for the removal of older RAF advisors from the program to get a fresh perspective. This would lead to most of the older British advisors from the pre-revolution days being removed from offices of influence. The proposal was out of the question. The manpower needed to get this moving wasn't even possible, and thus it was shut down hard. Though in the West, the Canadians had trouble pushing through and on some areas were even forced to retreat up north, in the East, a connection between the Americans and Canadians had almost been made. A large group of 2,000 to 3,000 Syndicalist troops divided the two factions, though a small workaround connection was established earlier. Along the shore, French ships waved the flags of victory in support of the war and to signal that help was on its way. The countryside was divided by big lakes and rivers, making the crossing and mobility of the infantry very poor. Though the held territory by the 3,000 Syndicalist troops decreased each day, they were still not able to break through, and so some of the Americans just went around them to link up with the Canadian forces. The spirits of the US troops were not as high as they were before the fall of Washington, but they would still not give up without a fight. The Canadians had lost 4,000 men during the 1.5 months that the war was now going on for them. As was feared, the entire front to the Midwest was too wide to handle by the few troops that Canada could spare. In June, some were pushed back to the point of the enemy standing on the brink of invading Canada. In Europe, Bulgaria, that had settled in its new governments in the Balkan states, had declared war on the Ottoman Empire that was still interwoven in battles all throughout. And soon thereafter, the war between the Pacific states and Mexico came to a close, with Mexico now having full control and standing on the doorstep of Canada. And then the Syndicalists indeed invaded Canada, as multiple areas along the front were wiped out or forced to retreat. But from the east, through the connection established between the Canadians and the US, American soldiers headed in to help their northern brothers. The expansion of the Canadian invasion was quickly halted as the Americans had the enemy surrounded. The link-up had done wonders as Americans poured into the Canadian lands and were resupplied and fed. In the east of Canada, the first of the Portuguese had arrived ashore and were on their way to the battlefield to stand side by side with their allies. Though the initial help of the Americans kept the Syndicalists from heading deeper into Canadian territory, it did not avert the CSA to head into the country from a different angle. Currently, the Americans did not have enough troops stationed there to keep border watch everywhere, but luckily, and just as planned, the Australasian troops had arrived in the west and were on their way to help defend the border. Though the incoming allies were a reason to be overjoyed, for about 15,000 troops stationed around Detroit, it fell on deaf ears as they had been cut off completely and were surrounded. More and more Americans familiarized themselves with the Canadian countryside as they were preparing for an attack from the north as well to divide the CSA main armies along the Midwest and East Coast. In Europe, news came out that the Austrian Empire had signed a white peace with the Ottomans, something that happened a lot recently, as the Ottomans had their hands full with so many enemies surrounding them. 2 months now that the war had been including the Entente, mixtures of Australasian, Canadian, British, and American infantry combined their forces to withhold the invading Syndicalists. But the CSA received help from allies as well, as Russia had sent in some of their best men, a few who were involved in the surrounding of the cut-off Detroit troops. To make things worse, the connection between the Americans and Canadians had been split as well. The split was not large, and higher-ups believed they would be able to link up again within the next 2 weeks. With so many troops and supplies needed to traverse through Canada, King Edward believed it of the utmost importance to improve infrastructure to allow quick passage for each and everyone and everything. The Americans and Canadians could really use some positive news, and this arrived in the form of acknowledgement that the Portuguese and West Indies faction had successfully pulled off a naval invasion to the south of the US forces. The Civil War had transformed into an utterly bloody mess of a conflict concerning many different countries and their soldiers. Sardinia, small but noble, also had set foot on American soil to help protect it from being further diminished by the Syndicalists. The US Navy had attempted an invasion around Houston, but though being able to capture the city, they were soon out of supplies and bound to lose the area once more. On the 1st of July, word got out that Washington had once again been captured by the US troops. Battles above the city still raged on with planes looming at one another. It was at the Second Battle of Washington, where ace pilot Francis Hastings, known under the call sign Moose, had distinguished himself in not only returning alive from the recent mission over Northeast, but living through significant victories in many critical encounters. Held up as a shining example of Canadian courage, Francis's recent promotion had been highly publicized. Although the people may view war as more hell than glory, many were glad to see that there were still heroes to rally behind. 10 days later, the feared escalation in South Africa occurred. With their recent victory in the South African 1936 elections, the Dominion Party under President Jan Smuts was confident it could implement its sweeping changes to the country's governmental system in a planned federation, regardless of protests from the Afrikaner provinces of Transvaal and the Oranje Free State. Today, that confidence was proven ill-founded, as leaders in Pretoria and Bloemfontein declared their secession from the Union and the creation of the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek. Battle lines had already been drawn, splitting the country in two, as a new Boer War was broken out to determine South Africa's path once more. That same day, Russia roared as well, as it was war-hungry for more territory it claimed was theirs by right. The world was bleeding all over, and this was not even the worst of it all. The worst had yet to come. The war that was continuing in America seemed never to diminish, as more and more allies of the Entente headed their way towards friendly shores. The Canadians had suffered great losses throughout, but other Entente members also had a price to pay in blood. The strength of the eastern shoreline was dwindling, with so many US soldiers migrating towards the southern borders of Canada. Europe seemed calm, but across the many divided nations, visions of war were brewing, and it was all but the question, who would strike first? Chances were high that this would be Russia, as it now declared an interest in European nations to reclaim after having done so successfully in Asia and the Middle East. The naval invasion by the West Indies also proved no success, as they did not have enough troops to hold the area and expand upon it once CSA resistance was met. For the Syndicalist forces, it proved difficult to make a large push up north with the Australasians and US infantry reinforcing the line. But that line was simply too big to hold altogether, and now CSA units were also spotted heading into Canada to the east. As a result, the King reached towards the emergency reserves to function as another line wherever they were needed. About 15,000 troops would be recruited for this final defense. Chaos was everywhere, and Africa was also not spared, as the Civil War had drowned all nations into an all-out conflict. It was difficult to keep track, with several factions gaining and losing territory every other week. From the sea to the east, more ships from Europe and Africa were heading in to provide the US troops with supplies, reinforcements, and weaponry. With American forces having entered Canadian territory, King Edward VIII addressed the Canadian public via radio with a grim message. He called for the Canadians to rise up and fight the combined syndicates of America, to resist with the knowledge that this was the last stand of the British Empire. It was here in Canada that the question of freedom would be decided. "We must not fall," he urged, and Canadians across the country rallied to his side in this, their most desperate hour. CSA forces were plagued by civil resistance and guerrilla fighters everywhere. Down south, things were rumbling as well, as news came out that Peru declared war on Ecuador. Latin America was also a ticking time bomb, where revolutionaries could seize opportunities to their advantage. And in Asia, where the Mongolians had seized so much power that, much like Icarus, they might now have flown too close to the sun, as rumor would have it that they had caught the attention of Russia to the north. Washington, that had changed owners over the past months multiple times, was once again lost to the CSA troops, as its ruins left an area that had more symbolic value than actual one. The Kaiser in Germany, who had to endure some increased negativity ever since Black Monday, with the loss of his African rule now being the most recent disaster, was taking very careful steps to strengthen his political power on a small, daily basis instead of making steps far and in between. The civil war in Spain also continued, as always, with no end in sight. The Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek seemingly had the upper hand over the Union of South Africa, with supporting troops being sent from countries nearby. The area that had been connecting Canada to the US-held territory had been cut off by the CSA, giving them control over multiple harbors as well. The CSA altogether held an incredible amount of territory and manpower, but the number of men in the field grew thin as they took heavy losses, and it proved difficult to keep every position reinforced enough to where every victory was bought with another loss. Though progress was slow, CSA troops managed to dig deeper into the flesh of Canada as the western front line shifted ever so slightly to the north. The 15,000 troops drummed up by the king and led by General Bert Hofmeister made their way to secure this part together with the US and Australasian allies. US troops managed to retake some ports again along the shore and also retake Washington in the process, creating a seemingly everlasting tug-of-war effect. In Africa, multiple war situations came to a resolve with the continent still thrown into chaos despite the number of wars diminishing. It was still difficult to make out what was happening and who would be the dominant victor in the end. And by the end of September, the rumors in the east proved to be true, as Russia, despite making moves towards Europe, declared war on the Mongols, who grew too arrogant and aggressive for their own good in their opinion. Despite the US forces being able to retake some cities and its ports, they were not able to re-establish a proper connection with Canada, and to make matters worse, the West Indies were almost driven back towards the sea by an overwhelming enemy force coming from the center. With Africa having exploded, one of the benefits regarding the Entente was the increased power of Portugal. The positions were not ideal, and there were many warring states in between the Portugal-held territory, but the Civil War gave opportunity for the country to strengthen its grip for country and faction alike. The war between the new Khan and the Russians was a war across the entire borderline. Due to the rumors sparking unrest in the weeks prior to this, the Mongolian army was able to react fast to the war declaration. The American and Canadian troops along the eastern coast were threatened to be cut off from the main forces to the west as some of the CSA troops headed up north. It seemed that war and bloodshed had become the norm for this world. With the Syndicalists heading north, an opportunity presented itself, as some US and Canadian forces were able to head east and cut off the supply routes, crippling the Syndicalists currently in Canada. The West Indies, who were struggling for the past weeks around the area of New Orleans, got reinforced by their French allies, who were able to hold as the West Indies licked their wounds. The Union of South Africa displayed a dominant role over the previously more aggressive Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek. It would not take long before they had been routed out. The attack to the east by the Canadians and US troops seemed a success at first, but they soon arrived at the same issue that so many of the CSA infantry had. The landmass they had to traverse was simply too big for 1,000 to 2,000 men. It did not take long before their taken territory was cut up into pieces by weaker enemy units. The battle in Russia was one of the fiercest yet. The casualty numbers were incredibly high. Russia suffered a huge number of dead soldiers compared to the Mongolians in such a short time, but there were always more soldiers to spare for them. Things calmed down a bit in the south as Ecuador and Peru had come up with a peace deal. The West Indies managed to pull off another naval invasion to the south and west of their current armies, where they had barely met any enemy resistance. And then the Dominionists won in South Africa. The civil war that had been ravaging South Africa was bloody and bitter, dividing across ethnicities, political ideology, and ancestry. The Dominionists fought to defend the Cape, while the isolated South Rhodesia protected Salisbury with every man they had, and the Afrikaners fought furiously on two fronts. As the dust settled, the Dominionists seemed to have come ahead, with the troops of Rhodesia and the Federation finally reuniting after a decisive push on Pretoria. If South Rhodesia would soon rejoin their federation, their bravery would probably further inspire the Rhodesian people. The Federation, on the other hand, would soon be looking outwards to the Entente. But with one war ending, another one was created, as the princely federation in India was challenged from within. And the never-ending civil war in Spain once again ran into the direction of a syndicalist victory, though they had been in this position before with unlucky results. With the war between the Russians and the Mongolians, Russia seemingly changed its perspective on the European direction and instead now looked towards the Middle East. The princely federation seemed to have trouble with the uprising occurring, much to the amusement of the Dominion of India to the north. In Europe, several countries were preparing for war. Something big was coming. Mussolini had ordered rigorous military training exercises across the whole country for what would come next. And then, in the last month of 1938, suddenly the tide seemed to have turned. The CSA did not have enough troops and manpower to hold such a widespread landmass, and for the first time in weeks, the Americans and Canadians pushed the CSA south again. This could be the time where the war turned into their favor. Ethiopia's only gain in the Weltkrieg, the prized coastal possession of Eritrea, was now in open revolt. Disgruntled by oppression, disrespect, and overtaxation, the oppressed Muslim and Christian forces of the nation rallied under one flag and wished to free their country. The Emperor of Abyssinia had already reacted with outrage, and so the Eritrean War of Independence began. The Ottoman Empire, that had done surprisingly well in a battle with so many enemies at once, was starting to get arrogant. They were already looking to another enemy without defeating the ones at hand. With the Mongols in conflict with Russia, the Ottoman thought it wise to declare war and attack from the west as the Mongols did from the east. But attacking Russia was incredibly risky, especially considering the fact that the Ottomans could not send their entire force towards the Russian front as they were still in combat with Iran and Egypt. In Canada, bells rang across many small towns as the CSA had trouble sending in enough troops to reinforce at the Canadian front line as they were being pushed back south. Their numbers of casualties were incredible. The Entente and US killed more CSA than they could reinforce, and slowly their fielded manpower started to dissolve. Nevertheless, they still had around 400,000 troops stationed on the battlefield, which was enough to make many more of their opposition bleed. The princely federation in India had dealt with one of the troubling factions attempting an uprising. There were more to be taken out, and it was expected that this would occur over the next coming weeks. With Canada's front line shifting slowly back south, the US and French troops to the east also started to increase the pressure on the Syndicalists to take back lost ground. The Australasians were able to secure a harbor and several towns by themselves, as they were now moving to reinforce the West Indies faction. The decision of the Ottomans to declare war on Russia had the expected outcome. It was simply impossible for them to fight this many battles at once, let alone have Russia be involved at the opposite side. War seemed to be the only thing on everyone's mind, as now also in Central America, hell broke out concerning Syndicalism, as Centro America and the United Provinces of America were now at war. Though it gave Canada an opportunity to fight against the Syndicalists on a new front, the king advised against this, as first the war in the US needed to be won. What also played an important part was that the United States was seen as a more powerful and therefore more valuable ally. With Russia now heading deeper into Asia due to their own escalated conflict with Mongolians, their leaders were looking at new opportunities in areas to claim for their ever-expanding territory. With things turning around for Canada for the first time in a long period, King Edward could concentrate on improving Canada's industry. With destroyed properties and factories, the people felt the need to do something for their country, and better and more efficient facilities than ever were being erected. As predicted, the Princely Federation had one more faction under its thumb, as the conflict within its borders seemed to be almost over. The Eritrea revolts also ended up falling short, as it did not take long before they were annexed and their equipment was seized. Though the Ottomans declared war on Russia since they were at war with Mongolia, other governments instead declared war on the losing Mongolian nation. A victory over the Mongols seemed much more sure than the giant behemoth known as Russia, and a behemoth it was, as it ate away at the Ottoman Empire, once proud and now losing at almost all fronts. The everlasting Spanish Civil War still seemed in the favor of the Syndicalists, but just as before, it proved too difficult to fight both factions at once. As one faction was losing, the other found an opportunity to counterattack the suppressor. With 1939 becoming a reality, new weapon models and therefore tactics could be developed to speed up the retaking of the US territory by the Entente. The front had almost shifted back entirely to the original borders between America and Canada. With so many members of the Entente being included in the war, King Edward made progress to reinforce his allies, not only for the war at hand, but also the one to come to retake the fatherland. The Mongolians were being defeated to the west and to the east. It would not take long before they would have to surrender or negotiate a deal. The country mass that they held made it to where the war would still last several months, but it did not look like they were going to end up on top. Though the situation in Japan had been critical ever since the peace with honor, with numerous economic crises, unrest, and ineffective response to German interventions in China leading to the collapse of the autocratic Tanaka regime, the Empire of the Rising Sun managed to bounce back, albeit as only a regional power with its influence limited to East Asia. However, the Japanese seemed determined to put this weakness to rest and announced their ambitions of seizing their place among the great powers once again, by force if necessary. The Ottoman Empire was devastated by the Russians, who pushed their forces all the way back and had conquered territory that on maps now resembled a Swiss cheese. The Ottomans were desperate. Where they had instigated so much war in the past, now they sought to seek peace deals, knowing they would not come out on top, but at least leave with their hide intact. The Egyptians and Iranians agreed, but Russia did not. Russia was insulted by the war declaration on them, and would only be satisfied if the Ottomans paid in their blood. Furthermore, conquering the Ottoman Empire gave the Russians a perfect entry field into Europe. A similar fate befell on the Mongolians, who were fighting a losing war and were brought to the brink, where they too requested peace deals to be made. The Fengtian government agreed, but once again, the Russians did not. Russians' power-hungry stance was something worrying to many world leaders, but most were occupied with matters of their own. With Japan's earlier aggressive notion on revealing its ambitions, it too declared war on Russia. The civil war against the Syndicalists in America had now shifted into territory of the US once more, with many forces of Canada and the Entente now heading east to help the assault at the front. The CSA was still the strongest here, as the front line was not as wide as the Midwest. The CSA makeshift capital for the moment was Chicago, but it was not too far from where the US Northern Front was currently held. New plans of attack were made to pincer assault the Syndicalists and cut off their supply line like an artery. And then, after so many painful and bloody years, the Spanish Civil War was finally over, and it seemed that the Iberian Federation had emerged triumphant. Much of the countryside lay in ruins, and order was not completely restored yet. But the anarcho-Spanish government announced that the old feudal order had finally been put to rest, and that the people of Spain would benefit from an orderly transition to a syndicalist regime. Massive crowds gathered in Barcelona to hail the returning militias and offer a prayer that the new peace would turn into a permanent one. Western leaders were now fearful of repercussions on another syndicalist nation coming into play. If they would join the Third Internationale, its power and potential dominance over Europe would be enormous. Lack of intelligence on the government of the Commune of France also did not help soften these feelings of unsettlement. Initially, and mostly because the attack came somewhat out of nowhere, the Japanese assault on Russia seemed to go fairly well, as did the assaults by the Entente and US troops on the Syndicalists, who were losing more territory every week. Bad news for the Entente arrived in that the Syndicalists had achieved a victory in Central America, and with Mexico right on their doorstep, it was but a matter of time to see if their next war would be condensed around Europe or to the south of them. After months of low-intensity skirmishes and diplomatic game-playing on the German-French border, the two behemoths were poised on the edge of potentially the most brutal conflict mankind had known since the dark days of the Weltkrieg. In a shocking escalation, the Communist government in Paris openly demanded the return of German-controlled Alsace-Lothringen seized after the War of 1871 by the victorious Reich. Flouting international norms, a single squadron of French planes flew into German airspace, dropping thousands of leaflets detailing their grievances, much to the displeasure of the Reich's general staff. Such actions were sure to outrage public opinion in Berlin, and mobilization efforts were underway. And with that, the Second Weltkrieg could no longer be avoided. The Weltkrieg claimed the lives of countless young men from all over the world in a conflict on an industrial scale, but it appeared that even that nightmare could not deter man's lust for blood. After over 20 years of proxy warfare, diplomatic pressure, and political squabbles, the uneasy peace between Germany and France had broken down. These two great powers were now intertwined in a war the likes of which the world had never seen. Crew guns, planes, ships, tanks, and deadlier weapons still would see their first use on the battlefield as open warfare began once more in Europe. For the Germans and the French, there could now only be one end: victory or destruction. With the Second Weltkrieg in full effect, and Germany and France being intertwined in a war once more, the death toll was rising at a staggering rate. All across the border, men fought and died for different ideologies. It did not take long before Wallonia, the lower half of former Belgium and recently overtaken by the Germans, capitulated. The government went into exile overseas, and it was expected that Flanders to the north would soon fall as well. In America, things were looking up for the Entente and the United States. Much of their former territory had been taken back, and they were punishing the Syndicalists left and right. The failed uprising in the area of the Princely Federation also came to a close, as those remaining who resisted were soon encircled, outnumbered, and outgunned. The Ottoman Empire, that had been devoured by the power of Russia for the past few weeks, was also attacked from the west by Bulgaria, hoping to snatch a few territories from its neighbor to increase in power herself. And indeed, 10 days later, Flanders also lost to the Commune of France. Though Belgium was not a big country, it did provide the French and the British syndicalists with some extra mileage to issue an invasion on Germany to the east. Hundreds of thousands of infantry headed into German land, leaving destruction in their wake. They were planning to expand their own might for the glory of the Internationale. Germany seemingly stood no chance. This counted also for the CSA, who once were seen as a serious threat, but were now reduced to only a small army that in no way could reinforce all the necessary fronts. The men were scattered, and morale was broken. Canadians and US soldiers headed towards Chicago to lay it in ash, then to rebuild it with a bright future ahead. As expected, the French and British forces used the widening front next to Holland as a way to slightly flank German units. But even without this flanking opportunity, France would still have the upper hand in this situation. They continued to conquer land at a breakneck pace, and were not too far from places like Hanover and Braunschweig. The Germans had almost suffered 100,000 dead during these weeks of battles, and though the opposing factions lost men of their own, none came close to the devastation done to Germany. In America, the numbers showed that the CSA faction had lost over 1 million men, which explained why they were faltering so hard. The war simply took its toll on the Syndicalists, who now stood alone and could only wait for certain defeat. From all sides, Entente soldiers and US infantry advanced. Some took the uprising by the CSA very personal, and war atrocities were committed by both sides during this conflict. Then the Ottoman Empire was finally defeated. Its own arrogance became its own destruction. With France continuing to dominate the pace, Belgium had been divided into two sections again, each with a government put in place by the Third Internationale. As a larger war was being fought, the Internationale in Paris could not afford to deal with setting up new systems, and left it to Julien Lahaut and Antoine Brownier. With the battle for Braunschweig underway, and a large group of British soldiers spearheading through the north, Berlin came dangerously close to the Syndicalist reach. To even put a stronger emphasis on their war effort, the British had pulled off a successful naval invasion near Danzig, which was taken by them in a matter of days. But in America, many were only focused on the victory that was so close for the Entente and the enemies of Syndicalism. They could almost taste the victory that was at hand. Before that victory was secured though, one more final battle would have to take place. The battle for Chicago. Meanwhile, Japan showcased that it too could hold its own as it conquered much territory from the Russians. Now most of it was considered no man's land, and the Russians did not have that many units stationed there to begin with, but the Japanese did do better than most expected. Things were looking ugly for Germany. The units stationed near Denmark were cut off, and many surrendered as their morale and spirits were broken by the showcase of force in such a brief period of time. And then finally the battle for Chicago began. Though the Syndicalists stood no chance, some of their most battle-hardened and most loyal soldiers were held up here. The battles were fierce, up close and personal, and bloody as hell. The battle for Chicago lasted almost 2 weeks, but then on the 21st of November 1939, Chicago finally fell. Federal forces had been pushing towards the city's center for a while. Reports were now going out publicly that the advancing troops had captured those in charge and took hold of the city. Though the city had fallen, chaos still ran rampant. Reports indicated that military police began rounding up and arresting potential agitators and important syndicalist figures, and that many fires were spreading unchecked through the city's high-rise districts. Though officially the war still continued after the fall of Chicago for 2 days, many saw this particular defeat as the end of the war. And on the 23rd of November, the CSA officially surrendered. Though territories were offered to the Entente, King Edward decided not to indulge, as his generosity and humbleness would hopefully convince MacArthur to join the Entente. With America as its ally, the Entente would rise to be one of the most powerful factions in the world. After so many years of war, people needed to get used to the notion of peace again. But now was the time to rejoice, to rebuild, and to be reunited with loved ones. Many Canadians, British exiles, but also Australasians, French, and Portuguese said goodbye to their brothers and returned home to their families. The Second American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict to ever descend on the New World, was over. And as sobbing widows buried their dead husbands and sons, the old USA regime had been replaced by a reactionary military dictatorship that had vanquished all rivals. General Douglas MacArthur had issued a nationwide crackdown on all possible enemies of the state and underground CSA and AUS successors. In Washington, a monument was erected in honor of Washington's hope, the brave soldiers who endured months of torment and tragedy, but who held firm and made this victory for the US possible. Now that peace was at hand once more, the Canadian government already started to look towards a possible agreement to bring America into the Entente. But time would be needed before this could be established. And with one peace labeled in the world, another conflict was unleashed, as Iran declared war on Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. On December the 11th, word came out that Berlin had fallen. Reports from the city confirmed that the German capital was captured by advancing Communist troops after long, merciless fighting through the greatest city of the Reichspakt. German forces put up stiff resistance, hoping to delay the Communist forces as long as possible, but were eventually beaten back. As shocked Berliners looked on, the Communist army paraded down the Brandenburg Gate, before organizing a choir to sing the Internationale as the famous monument was rigged with explosives and destroyed for all the world to see. This extreme act seemed to have painted the following night, as Communist forces began rounding up German soldiers and dignitaries, bringing them away in military police wagons. And all the while, the Asian front was a mess when it came to the fighting with Russia. With Germany being in such a dire situation, Austria decided to intervene in the Second Weltkrieg. Some military minds in Europe had believed that any inevitable continental war would be over in a matter of months due to powerful new technological advances. However, any lingering delusions about the scale of modern warfare had quickly vanished in the face of horrid tales of brutality coming out of the conflict ravaging Western Europe. Vienna had looked on with trepidation at the rearmament of the Syndicalist powers for years, but now, with open conflict threatening to upturn the balance of power in Europe, they had decided to openly intervene against the Internationale. Then, at the end of 1939, more good news arrived for the Entente. MacArthur had agreed, after seeing the loyalty and friendship provided by the Entente, to join Canada's faction. This new alliance would be earth-shattering, as some already looked to the east, where another terrible war was fought. America joined a large group of proud nations, which would have each other's back in conflict to come. With war no longer being an issue for Canada, its government could finally focus once more on industry and wealth. An investment in natural resources would surely be a splendid idea to the steps taken to rebuild the nation. But then, on January 10th of 1940, not even 2 months after the Civil War had ended, word came out that Sardinia had declared war on Italy and therefore on the Internationale itself. Canada and all other Entente members were called out once more to fight the Syndicalist enemy. With the Syndicalists being faced against so many enemies, including the still standing Reichspakt, Edward hoped to put an end to Syndicalism sooner than expected. He accepted, and so the Entente got involved in the Second Weltkrieg as well. The Second Weltkrieg was unleashed on the world, and both the Reichspakt and the Entente were now interwoven in conflict with the Third Internationale. At the same time, amidst the chaos, Russia used this opportunity to declare war on neighboring Iran. All hands were on deck. The whole country of Canada that had just got out of the war in the US stood up and got to work again for a war now being fought on a different continent. Around 60,000 fresh troops were being recruited and trained for combat in Europe amongst many other allies of their faction. Canada's fleet would patrol the Canadian and American coasts to prevent the situation where the enemy would come too close. America, on the other hand, would send in its fleet to Europe to wage war on the open sea belonging to the Syndicalists. The image of Central Europe soon shifted towards a total war zone, with many planes dancing through the skies, chasing prey above nations like Sardinia that was responsible for getting the Entente involved on such a short notice. The German Empire, that was no ally of the Entente and neither an enemy, asked for a non-aggression pact to ensure all the focus from both factions would be on the Syndicalist countries alone. America was in full motion as well. Many felt they owed a great deal to their Canadian friends, and soldiers would fight gladly by their side once more. Even though this war was seen mostly benefiting Canada and France, the Americans inherited a strong hatred for Syndicalism after the Civil War. With both factions combined, the Syndicalists faced double the amount of men, but the Reichspakt at the moment was crippled, with Germany doing very badly in the war. In January of 1940, a strong winter was upon the lands, which complicated matters for both fighting sides. America showcased its overwhelming power on the sea, as it had started to take down British freighters and take control of their waters. Island nations, like Sardinia, were covered in bunkers all over the place. It was as if an entire shell covered their ground. Ireland, that was part of the Reichspakt, also tried to get on Canada's good side by offering some equipment. Ireland stood right on the doorstep of the Union, and also had seaforts and bunkers positioned everywhere. To showcase a sign of friendliness, both Canada and Ireland agreed on a potential military access. While most countries were focused on the Weltkrieg, Iran was being torn apart from two sides by Saudi Arabia and Russia. But one should not forget about Japan, which still continued to claim territory from Russia and moving west land inward at a snail's pace. The chaos in Asia escalated even further as the Feng Tian government declared war on Qing. In Quebec, about 15,000 Austrian troops had arrived to receive training from Canada's elite units. It further showcased a positive interaction between the enemies of Syndicalism and the Entente. Ships from the West Indies and Portugal patrolled the British waters, acting as watchdogs for neighboring Ireland. It was Portugal that had bled the most in the short period of time the Entente got involved. Most victims were those aboard their ships being sunk by the British. It would still take many weeks before Canadian and American units would set foot on European soil, and chances were likely that Germany would not hold out long enough to witness this. But ships were on their way, and most battles were currently only done by the Navy, which dominated the European seas in a matter of days. Germany already looked like it was on its last legs. If Germany would fall, many other neighboring states would fall immediately as well, dealing a devastating blow to the enemies of the Syndicalists. More Austrian volunteers were sent out to other Entente countries, including Portugal. But also America received its share of troops to train and exchange information directly from the European front. Finland was also part of the Reichspakt, and had a few thousand troops stationed in some of the more heavily defended bunker locations in Ireland. But since Russia was also considered an enemy, Finland would have to fight its own war mostly, and stay out of the conflict in Central Europe. Then what was feared earlier became reality. The Iberian Federation, standing victorious after the Spanish Civil War, had a syndicalist government, but was not yet part of the Internationale. Many people expected a merge, and on the 11th of March 1940, they did indeed side with the syndicalist faction, making them the enemy of the Entente. Portugal halted their battles at sea, and instead attacked to their direct east. This extra nation to the Internationale could mean terrible things for the opposing factions, as now there was a buffer zone between them and France, whereas Germany desperately tried to hold on. By March, the snow had cleared, and the French were relentless with their showcase of power. To the east, the Ukraine, part of the Reichspakt, was eaten away by Russia, not able to provide any troops for the purpose of defending Germany. Austria, though sending thousands of volunteers to fight, stayed out of the war officially, much to the dismay of the Germans. In the Middle East, a side that was untouched by the Weltkrieg, Iran continued to lose ground daily to both factions it was entangled with. The initial reports coming from the Portuguese front were positive. With the help of Austrian volunteers, they were able to steamroll eastward, before the Spanish were even able to set up a good line of defense. To divert some attention from the German onslaught, the West Indies assaulted multiple coastal areas, hoping to force France into sending more troops west. Portugal was doing great, but the Iberian Federation showed resilience all throughout the year-long civil war and would not easily give up. By the 11th of April, the West Indies had managed to set foot on French soil. Though they had initially sent over 10,000 troops, they were soon surrounded by a superior French force. But the Kingdom of France also successfully pulled off a naval invasion to the south, and for those few troops who witnessed this, it was glorious. Finally, after so many years of exile, they were back on their home turf. With multiple naval invasions being a success, more reinforcements would be necessary, and Canada and America would send over troops immediately. Despite the persistent display of dominance, the invasions did seem to work, as the Germans were still in the running game. By April 16th, about 50,000 Canadian troops would be sent over to Europe, but it would take more than a month before they would arrive. Portugal's rampage came to a halt as the Spanish held their composure and now fought back fiercely. Together with the help of Sardinia, the Kingdom of France was successful in liberating a few more towns and harbors as Syndicalist forces rushed in to counterattack. As this invasion seemed more of a success, it was decided that the Canadian troops would be deployed here. Then, entirely outside of the conflict, it was revealed that the Norwegian Socialist Republic declared war on neighboring Sweden. Besides the German Empire, other nations were dwindling as well, especially with Russia on everyone's doorstep. With the Entente dominating the waters, the Kingdom of France successfully made a naval invasion in the north of Spain. But they only sent about 3,000 men, and this would not be enough to both hold their taken port and expand. To the south, however, things were going better, though they had run into a blockade as Syndicalist France pulled in a lot of men from the east. As a result, it had the desired effect of relieving some of the German troops who were able to push back. Yet in the east, in countries like Finland, Russia showed no holding back, as it devastated several Reichspakt countries at the same time. Governments, like those of the United Baltic Duchy and Lithuania, stood no chance to the mighty Russian Republic. Within a few weeks, the Baltic Duchy fell, meaning Lithuania could now be attacked from two sides. The successful invasion of the Kingdom of France to the south did not last very long. Soon their infantry were cut off from one another, and taken harbors were purged. This meant the incoming Canadian and American troops would have to alter their course. To make matters worse, because the Syndicalists achieved to hold off the invaders at the coast, they could focus once more on the Germans to the east, who were once again on their last legs. With the French attacking from the west, and the Russians approaching from the east, it seemed that the German Empire was doomed. As the Internationale to the west showcased its power to the world, Russia crept ever so closer to Germany in the east. Though the attacks against Finland were an overall success, there was one interesting turn of event during the war. Petrograd had fallen, The great Russian city, built by Peter the Great, was captured. Russian defenders initially held back the Finnish army across the Neva River, but a few days later those positions finally fell. Sustained cannon fire on Vasilyevsky Island had put the last defenders out of their misery. Some military tacticians had mentioned that with proper defense, the city would have held out for years, but the Finnish momentum carried them through the city faster than that. The Finnish army soldiers were using the palace square as a staging ground for moving throughout the rest of the city, and there were rumors of Finnish soldiers taking celebratory tours through the Great Museum of Artillery, confident they would put their own mark on the military history of the Russian Republic. But though this was a victory for the Finns, overall they were losing the war. Russia's vengeance on losing the city was swift and deadly. They were dominating despite the ever so increasing presence of the Japanese to their eastern front. With the war now shifting to Europe, King Edward approved the National Housing Act. By doing this, more factories, both civilian and military, were built all over Canada, increasing the country's production capabilities. Battles between the Portuguese and the Iberian Federation were bloody. Both were helped by allied nations. Halfway through May, Finland had been pushed back to a point where they could no longer function, and on the 19th of that month, Finland capitulated, giving Russia now a bigger chance to focus on countries directly linked to Germany. The Kaiser's empire crumbled even more after this. Many soldiers and officials fled the country knowing they could no longer win with Russia being more than just a nuisance. The Portuguese desperately tried to spearhead in order to force the Commune of France to relieve pressure once more, but by this time, the Iberian defenses were more sophisticated than before. After Finland had fallen, Russia could send the forces stationed there to join the soldiers fighting the Ukraine to the south. A mere month later, Kiev fell. With the thriving hub now in Russian hands, the rest of the Ukrainian lands were in jeopardy. While the Russian Republic promised to respect the 700 years of history built up since the Mongols destroyed it in 1204, Kievan memory was long. Invaders had never been kind to them, and they feared the worst. With Kiev in Russian hands, it did not take long for the entire nation to surrender. And then, on the 27th of June, with both Finland and the Ukraine destroyed, the German Empire officially surrendered. The German Kaiser fled the country, and it now seemed that the Entente would be the main enemy of the Syndicalist forces. Countries belonging to the Reichspakt were divided amongst Russia and France, and many were puppeted as governments were put in place chosen by the Internationale. Morocco was one of those, making it now an easy target for the Kingdom of France. Now it seemed that the Syndicalists had actually more manpower than the Entente, and things could go very different from now on. Ireland no longer was part of the Reichspakt, though many citizens still held a great hatred for Syndicalism and the Union of Britain. The same counted for Morocco, which was now part of the Internationale, but many of its soldiers and citizens were still loyal to the Kaiser. Many deserted and joined the French soldiers instead, who accepted them as brothers in arms. Despite the setback, Portugal continued to press the pace on the British and French soldiers as enemy ships patrolled their coasts. Morocco had now been fully overtaken by the Kingdom of France, which would now focus on aiding their Portuguese allies. With Germany no longer being a threat, the Commune of France could send all of their units to the west to face Portugal. Portugal did not possess the same strength as Germany did, and would surely fall quickly if not reinforced soon. At the same time, Russia could now focus on fixing its issue with Japan to the east. With Germany out of the way, France now invaded Austria, which refrained from direct war confrontation earlier. It seemed that this decision came to haunt them in the end. Though Austria had allies of their own, many believed they were not enough to stop the upgraded Internationale. With the West Indies displaying such a dominant role in all of the wars, King Edward granted them some investment opportunities to hopefully aid them in their war effort as well. All the while this tragedy unfolded, Sweden, up in the north, had slayed Norway with ease, and in the first week of October, they took the country for themselves. The Commune of France continued to showcase muscle power, but the Iberian Federation, that was confident as well, let it go to their heads. Bulgaria, now thrown into the war as well due to Austria, managed to pull off a naval invasion to the east, surprising the Internationale and even taking Barcelona. But as so many countries, they made the mistake of sending only a few thousand, and this was not enough to hold the taken ground. Where before the Internationale enjoyed the help from Russia, this was not the case in the war with Austria. Nevertheless, they were confident enough that with the increased manpower, they would surely win over the Austrians. Battles were fierce but sluggish due to the rough terrain over which they fought. And all the while, Saudi Arabia and Russia continued to humiliate Iran, where only the most loyal soldiers still fought solely for their honor rather than the continuation of their country. By the end of 1940, Dwight D. Eisenhower was now in command of America. With Germany out of the picture, he urged the importance of stopping syndicalist expansion and sent over more troops to Portugal. The infantry fighting the battles here now had a higher American count than Portuguese. With the Internationale being able to take back some of their waters, the government in Paris decided to reorganize their naval capabilities to keep Entente allies out. Then on the 31st of October, Iran officially surrendered and the lands were divided among Saudi Arabia and Russia. The landmass belonging to the Russian Republic was immense and had control and influence in various continents. With the syndicalists rising in power, Dwight D. Eisenhower believed that they might have to resort to more drastic measures if it would come to that. A letter dedicated to King Edward approved the beginning steps into atomic research for weapon usage. Sardinia once again achieved a naval invasion, though this time it was of a smaller scale than the one before. With the American help, Portugal thrived in combat, as Eisenhower had more troops sent in. Then something interesting occurred in Scotland. The West Indies, backed by the Canadian funding, had successfully performed a naval invasion on the northern coast and had now invaded the Scots and taken them by surprise. The overzealous Americans in Portugal stampeded their way through the Iberian defenses. The Spanish were no match for their superior firepower. The Austrians proved to be a tougher adversary than the Germans, as one of the reasons was their wide front being difficult to puncture. Over half of the former Spanish country was now in the hands of the Entente, and it looked like the Iberian Federation would soon capitulate. In the final month of 1940, the Internationale achieved some success in the battles with Austria and headed land inward at the northeastern flank. The invasion of Scotland by the West Indies was halted quickly, as they were no match for British reinforcements who answered the call. Some of the countries, like Greece and Austria, tried to attack from a different side as they bombarded Italy to find a weak spot to infiltrate. A large amount of Canadian infantrymen had successfully made the cross and were now about to land at Portugal to help their fellow allies. Though the Entente was winning, the war was a complete mess, with several divisions still holding control of countrysides that were already overtaken by the Americans. They were destroying it from the inside. India, the one nation staying surprisingly absent during the US Civil War conflict, finally bared its teeth, as it too had managed to perform a naval invasion against the Internationale. Portugal had sent word that they would take care of the Iberian Federation forces that were behind the lines, and the Canadian troops hurried themselves over to the front. The border with France seemed like a good choke point where a sturdy defensive line could be set up. In the first month of 1941, the syndicalist troops, who were stirring chaos in the south of Spain, were beaten by a superior force that had them surrounded. Word then arrived that it was America who successfully performed a naval invasion on the British coast. This news, of course, fueled the hearts of the Canadians and exiled British, and around 20,000 troops were immediately sent out to help the US soldiers in retaking the homeland. This tremendous news also arrived in Spain, and many of the troops fighting for Canada celebrated that night in the trenches and bunkers with fellow mates that this would surely be the beginning of the end. But taking Britain would prove difficult, as the British government were sending in all troops from all corners of the country to crush the American invaders. By the 3rd of February, the divisions deep within Spanish territory were destroyed, and the very next day, the Iberian Federation officially surrendered. Though this was the first major victory for the Entente, the war was far from over, as now, the battle for France was about to begin. As 1941 was well underway, the Second Weltkrieg and its ravaging nature ever so escalated to new fronts over Europe. The naval invasion at the British coast by the Americans were an initial success, but British resistance was fierce. Though help was underway, the Brits had cut off some of the taken harbors, meaning that the US soldiers would soon be left to their doom. Blood was drawn everywhere, and though the opposition did have more manpower compared to the Syndicalists, they did not seem to puncture any of their main defenses. By the end of February, all of the US troops in Britain were killed or surrendered, with 20,000 Canadians mere days away from arriving. At the same time, Commune reinforcements had arrived at the border with Portugal and started increasing the pressure put on the Entente troops. With the British harbors back in the Union hands, the Canadian troops were forced to head to nearby friendly Portugal. They would help reinforce the front line that could not cope with the increased enemy resistance. Then, on the first day of March, the Russian Republic declared war on the Polish Socialist Republic, meaning that now Russia was at war with the Internationale as well. This was great news for the Entente and Austria. Surely, with Russia fighting the same enemy, there was no way they could lose. The Internationale were now facing a force that had 3 times their manpower. Though France and Russia were fighting side by side during the battles against Germany, now they were on opposite sides once more. Countries that were formerly in the Reichspakt and still had a great hatred towards the Internationale sided with Russia, even though it pained them to side by one of the countries who were responsible for the fall of the Kaiser's empire. The Russian government made it clear to Canada and the Entente that it had no intentions to intervene with their battles in any way, and thus a non-aggression pact was established. Russia was still battling with Japan though, and could thus not send its entire army towards Central Europe. Nations like the Turkish Commune, formerly known as the Ottoman Empire, acted as a doorway to flank and attack the Internationale from opportune angles. Russia's help came as a godsend, as the troops in Portugal were losing ground rapidly, due to an overwhelming amount of reinforcements coming down on them hard. Invasions everywhere were halted, and it became clear that the Internationale was a force to be reckoned with. But Bulgaria pulled off a dominating display as they invaded near Belgium and spearheaded through French countryside. Romania was battling with the Italians on Sicily to get hold of the island and use that as a base of operations to direct an assault on all of Italy from the south. Russia started to eat away at France, but in the 3 weeks that they were now involved in the war, not much had changed. Near La Rochelle, another naval invasion was performed, and yet again, only by a few thousand men, meaning it would not take long before they would be overrun and taken aback. In the final week of March, the incredible news went out that Paris had fallen. Reports from the city confirmed that the Communist capital had been captured by advancing Bulgarian troops after furious fighting across its large avenues in the Seine. Communist forces put up stiff resistance, hoping to delay Bulgarian forces as long as possible, but were eventually beaten back. As shocked Parisians looked on, the Bulgarian army paraded towards the Eiffel Tower. This festive atmosphere eventually devolved into vicious urban combat, however, with Communist resistance in the dead of night and Bulgarian force easily plowing through inefficient barricades in the large Parisian avenues. With the capital fallen into enemy hands, the rest of the Internationale received a heavy blow in morale. 3 days later, it became public that the Flemish Communal Republic had fallen, with experts believing the Wallonian Communal Republic would soon be next, and within a week, that indeed fell too. This was a huge victory for the opposition of Syndicalism, but at the same time, they were gaining huge victories at the Portuguese front, so much so that they could spare reinforcements from there to strengthen fronts elsewhere. Soldiers from the Union of Britain, Italy, and France all helped to secure the Portuguese lands taken from the invaders. It did not take long before France launched a huge offensive on the Bulgarians to punish them for making such a bold move. Then news arrived that trouble was stirring in Central America, where syndicalist nations conflicted directly with the West Indies. Many believe these were set in motion behind the scenes by the French and British. If things would escalate in a war with Central America, Canada would stand beside its ally, the West Indies. With the Second Weltkrieg in full effect, King Edward approved the homecoming plan made years earlier for the inevitable battle with Britain. This would mostly secure Canada's shoreline, something that seemed like a good idea with the resistance they found in Portugal. The offensive launched by the French seemed to work, and it gave them hope that they were now able to fight at 3 different fronts at the same time. By the end of April, Central America had officially been taken in by the Internationale, throwing it into combat as well. Canada promised to come to the West Indies' aid, but also knew that Central America, as it stood, formed no threat to anyone with naval blockades all around. And all the while Portugal was still slowly being pushed back, other countries looked for new opportunities to attack. Romania continued to chip away at Italy's defenses by probing naval invasions in multiple areas. Austria still held strong with Russia to the east not performing to its expected strength. If even the addition of Russia would not make a difference in the pacing now dominated by the Internationale, the Entente could be in a lot of trouble. The Internationale simply had so many troops everywhere. Time and time again, the naval invasions by the Romanians were put to rest, though it did take a toll on the morale and resources of the Italians. Even the Greeks meddled with them by using their opportune position as an advantage to easily issue naval invasions on the enemy. Russia now was heading deeper into Polish territory, and Finland did the same to France. But Russia did have trouble keeping a clean front line across the board. The South African Federation saw an opportunity once more to attack Scotland from afar, as most reinforcements sent there last time had all moved to other places across Britain or Central Europe. Russia, that was having trouble spearheading through Poland, used the Finnish conquered territory as a new route to cut off some of the Internationale forces fighting in the east. Though initially the South Africans were successful in claiming some territory in Scotland once again, it did not take long before dedicated reinforcing troops ended their attempt in blood. The Romanians and Austrians were able to claim almost 90% of Sicily, but were not able to drive the enemy off the island completely. This was mostly due to several divisions driven towards this one choke point, making it impossible to combat effectively due to its narrow-minded front line. However, the Austrians were having a bit more success up north in Italy, thanks to one of the many naval invasion attempts by the Romanians. Despite the opposition eating away at the Internationale from different angles, it were their enemies who suffered heavier losses and death tolls. Reports arrived directly from the battlefield in Portugal about the terrible circumstances the soldiers were fighting in. They were facing hundreds of thousands of enemy infantry and were low on supplies, whereas the Syndicalists were rearmed and resupplied every day. Russia was not making much progress either. The Internationale could afford focusing on Portugal now and then finally send those troops over to Eastern Europe to deal with the meddling Russians. By having their troops pushed back into Portugal, the front line widened again and the Entente simply did not have enough troops here to secure it at all places. And Austria still could not take a complete hold of the south of Italy, as Greek and Romanian invasions were once again halted. The Austrians still held like they always did, and hoped for an opening from either the western or eastern front for them to make a difference. Bulgaria this time tried to invade Italy, maybe with the hopes of attacking and flanking the Italian forces held up at the choke point to the south. The Entente by now had lost almost 50% of their gained territory during the war in Portugal. Overall, it was a huge mess and a signal to all those heeding a warning that this war was far from over. The war in Portugal continued along its long before set turmoil path. Where the Entente had fought back the Syndicalists up until the border with France, now they were being pushed back almost into the sea. Only a bunch of small areas were left, scattered and scarred, held by men who grew more desperate by the hour. An evacuation had been set in motion by multiple Entente countries. Canada managed to successfully evacuate 40,000 men, while others were chosen to stay behind to cover the evacuees. Many of them paid with their lives. Though it had been predicted for weeks, a devastating blow was dealt to the Entente on October 23rd, when news went out that Lisbon had fallen to the Syndicalists. With the help of Italy, the Union of Britain, and the Commune of France, Spain had been reinstated into their ranks with extra landmass stolen from Portugal. 5 days after the fall of Lisbon, word got out that Portugal had capitulated. Though many thought that the fighting in this area was done with, the truth of the matter was that the battle for Portugal was far from over, as France was about to make a critical mistake. In a similar sense as before, France pulled back most of its troops out of Portugal to aid in the battle against Austria and Russia to the east. They left it to countries like Italy to deal with the leftovers of the Entente. But the Italians were not as well trained, and those fighting on the Entente side were able to hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Canada also sent fresh troops towards Europe once more, but this time it was not Portugal they were being sent to. Both Finland and Russia were unable to get a firm grip on the pacing for the war to the east. Many would have thought Russia to perform better, but it turned into a true slugfest. The nation that surprised everyone was Austria, standing robust like an unbreakable wall. It was true that the Syndicalists were making progress on invading the country little by little, but their morale had been shaken at the resilience of the Austrian soldier. As 1942 rolled by, new innovations regarding weapons technology were also implemented, and Canada was one of the first countries to do so. At the beginning of the second week of that year, the Americans launched another assault in Portugal to take the land back once more. They requested other countries to join as well, but Canada had different plans. A similar battle tactic in Portugal would surely once again end in failure once France resets their forces on the border, especially with France actually making progress against the Russians. Italy, that still held, but was faltering at several sides with Austria and Romania dealing blows left and right, was seen by King Edward as the next target that could actually be destroyed. As the first month of 1942 came to a close, it was revealed publicly that the Feng Chan government in Asia had fallen. Battle for dominance continued on this side as well, though it was not the focus of the Entente forces for the moment. Nations like the Dominion of India and the West Indies had joined the second assault in Portugal, and slowly they were fighting their way up north again. But Canada was about to send 20,000 troops towards Sicily to aid Romania and Austria in the fight against Mussolini's forces. The island of Sicily itself had been secured and was now held by a combination of Austrian, Romanian, Greek, and Russian units. In a month's time, the second offensive had gained a lot of momentum and territory back. The Syndicalist troops in Portugal had mostly been less experienced units and were easily overwhelmed. In the second half of March, the Canadian troops were about to arrive in Sicily. An offensive spanning the main Italian land had already been underway to attack it from both the north and the south. The Canadians were received as brothers by the other nations, and many shared stories, delicacies from their home country, and smokes as they made their way to the east. And then once more, news arrived from Asia, as the Mongolians had fallen as well. An ending that was set in motion from the moment that their greedy Khan came into power. By the first week of April, the Entente had almost taken back the entirety of Portugal once more, but news arrived that the Commune of France was indeed marching troops towards their border area as well. The 20,000 Canadians had finally joined the Austrians and Romanians, and together would spill blood on Italian soil. Though most of the opposition consisted of Italian troops, some of them were aided by British Syndicalist forces. By now America had reached the French border in the exact location where they previously were being pushed back. Though French reinforcements were on their way, they were still on the move, giving the soldiers of the Entente hope to at least head deeper into France than previously. The assaults in Italy also went swell for the Entente, mainly due to the front line being narrow and the opposition being inexperienced. Most of the Italians' best troops had perished during the battles in Sicily over the past months. They had suffered more than 500,000 casualties during this war. By May the 7th, what was predicted by King Edward seemingly became true. The second offensive in Portugal by the Americans was halted as the French had arrived and once again pushed the invader back south. As the Canadians were stormwalling over the Italian landmass, they left pockets of resistance here and there. Friendly nations like the Russians said that they would take care of it, as most of the soldiers either capitulated or were driven into the sea as they did their brave last stand. By June the 2nd, it became clear how much of a similar display in Portugal was about to happen, with so much territory lost to the Syndicalists once more. It was a stunning display. Where the Syndicalists were gaining so much ground to the west, they were losing it to the east. The real question was, though, if the destruction of Italy and a possible third offensive in Portugal could be enough to tip the scale. By the first week of July, the Kingdom of France had successfully pulled off a naval invasion on the French homeland. This took a new turn, as they now were in control behind enemy lines. Though the Canadian troops had made great progress over the last weeks, their pace was being forced slower and slower due to increased enemy resistance the closer they got to Rome. At the end of July, the Americans and other Entente members had once again fully been pushed to the shore. It was uncertain if another offensive would indeed be greenlit by their generals. Austrian soldiers were involved in heavy fighting along the Italian coast to secure the northern part of the country, as most of the south had already been dealt with. Instead of launching a new offensive in Portugal, America took the opportunity of the naval invasion done by the Kingdom of France to send more troops directly into the heart of the Syndicalist nation. But they met heavy enemy resistance from every angle. By now, the Syndicalists had put a dent in the Austrian front line, but the overall defensive line was still so wide that not much progress could be done. The amount of reinforcements currently situated in Portugal was worrying. Though the Kingdom of France was making headway up north, it was questionable what the outcome would be were these units to reinforce at their front. Then on the 30th of August 1942, news arrived that Italy had capitulated. For the moment, control was reinstated with Romania as the Italian government went into exile. This was another great victory for the Entente, but it was now a question if they could hold the taken land, unlike Portugal. The Canadian troops near Rome were immediately sent north towards the border with France and secure it. From here on out, an establishment with the Kingdom of France needed to be made to strengthen the front taken with the naval invasion. A new offensive plan was made as the Canadians would push with their tanks and infantry up north to secure a bigger landmass, as the Kingdom of France would move east towards the newly established Romanian border and secure any harbors to the south. With France being forced, to send even more reinforcements from the Eastern Front to deal with both the attacks around Portugal and now also with the kingdom's naval invasion, it gave Russia the long-sought opportunity to finally move west. The Syndicalist French were bleeding. Everyone punished them from all sides, and by now, the war had cost them almost 2.5 million men in total. A third offensive in Portugal seemed unlikely by now. Even if the French reinforcing units were to leave, they would meet resistance where the exiled French had planned their naval invasion, thus putting them in hand's reach to counter another resurgence. But then, right as things started to look up, the Kingdom of France got word that turmoil was brewing from within as multiple uprisings occurred in their held territory in Africa. They would now be forced to divide their strength overseas and domestically. The Second Weltkrieg in Central Europe ravaged on as the forces of the Entente made their way into France thanks to a successful naval invasion to the south. The Kingdom of France for a moment looked worried when revolts came from within, but some of these were already stuffed within a mere week. Their government released a public statement that they still would be able to put their full strength behind the front lines of the war where necessary. Portugal, that had experienced many different offensives from either side, seemed to shift again as the Entente forces headed up north. Though at first glance, this was a reason to rejoice for some. After 2 failed attempts to capture and hold the landmass, this did little to get but a cheer out of many who heard the news. And so the front lines started to shift into the favor of the Entente on all sides. And with Austria and Russia heading west as well, it was clear to many that Syndicalist France's days were numbered. But the French had a lot of people stationed around the Russian line and managed to break up the army near the border of Denmark. And at the same time, they had hundreds of thousands of troops lined up near the Entente's attacking troops, but were faltering at multiple sections across the wide front. The Austrians and Russians tried to link up with the Entente units to their west to secure a greater part and increase the pace of pushing their enemy towards the North Sea. In only a few months, the Americans and Portuguese managed to drive the Syndicalists to the edge of the landmass once more. There seemingly came no end to the tug-of-war effect. It was a reason for reminiscing about the Spanish Civil War back in the day. Many believed a similar display would occur where they would not be able to hold the country. But packs of Syndicalist infantry were still scattered about, and though the naval invasion by the Kingdom of France was a success, they were not able to close the border where the Entente currently was holding Portugal and the former lands of Spain. Setback could be felt in the east too, as the Russian attempt to head west seemed to have been destroyed as the French wrath was felt all over. From a military point of view, America was desolate, with all the millions of men it sent over to Europe to fight the war. Some feared that Mexico might attempt something in the near future if it got a whiff of this information. Indeed, as predicted, as April rolled around, the Syndicalist faction pushed back against the Entente troops in Portugal again. Though this third offensive seemed a success, it was done hastily, and there were not many men stationed across the front. It would not be long before they would be pushed towards the coast once more. By now, the Austrians had managed to link up with the Canadians and French as they invaded Luxembourg and shifted their way up north. The Commune of France had now lost over 3.1 million men. An incredible loss, and though they still had a lot of troops left, it was clear that the enemy was chipping away at their built-up establishment. Though dominance at sea was first handed to the Entente, the Union of Britain managed to muster a lot of threat as massive battles between fleets were mixed with suspenseful encounters with submarines. A small part of the American army headed into Central America as they were not seen as an important opponent, but rather a quick stab to gain some extra necessary resources. Portugal by now was in the hands of the Syndicalists again. What stood out was the fact that many of the soldiers fighting here were of Italian descent. They fought during the Second Offensive and were unable to return to their homeland before it was too late and got taken over by the invaders. Russia continued to increase its presence and dominance in Asia, while at the same time create a war effort for Central Europe. The Americans and Canadians tried their best to cut off the enemy troops south of them. If they were able to cut them off, they would eventually run out of supplies, and a fourth and final offensive could end the seemingly endless tug-of-war struggle. There were still tens of thousands of mostly Portuguese soldiers fighting to hold the ports to hopefully one day pull forth an offensive again. One of these days, a side would run out of supplies, they thought. But desperation seemed to hide the fact how powerful the Commune of France actually was. Then on the 26th of June 1943, Dwight D. Eisenhower announced that the cowardly Central American nation could no longer withstand the pressure from the overwhelming presence of American forces throughout the country. The Central American government chose to flee and went into exile. Their main forces had capitulated, and the United States of America was now in control of their home area. Halfway through July, the Austrians had managed to take a large part of France back and were also well on their way heading into Poland. There was still a large main supply line running through former Belgium that they currently were aiming to overtake. By the 14th, Luxembourg had indeed capitulated as the Entente forces moved up north. They were getting closer and closer to the coast, and many soldiers thought that the end was near. But the Syndicalists had millions of men lined up across the French countryside, and their resilience had been showcased in the past. The Portuguese, who had been pushed to the coast, were diluted even further, and many were not that confident in the existence of a fourth offensive after all. Things also started to falter in the north, as part of the Commune troops managed to flank the kingdom's forces to the east and were headed in to retake the ports and harbors during the naval invasion by the Kingdom of France. The Russians had also encircled Poland, and together with the Austrian troops, they were dealing death and destruction as they crushed the nation from all sides. Poland stood alone. Aerial photographs made it stand out to anyone that France and Poland would fall in the next couple of months. But there was that one small part of the Syndicalist army that countered across the French coastline that should not be forgotten. Though Poland did not lose as many people as the Commune of France had, they were not as equally powerful, and thus the death and destruction hit much harder. Once Poland would have been dealt with, all of Austria, along with a lot of Russians, would come down upon France with terrible anger. The news about the losing Syndicalists fueled the Portuguese with the motivation they needed to start another offensive of their own. But certain generals were of the opinion that they acted rash and headed out into the open without linking up with other ports for reinforcements. Then by the 26th of September, Austria and Russia had completely engulfed the French territory that formerly belonged to the German Empire. Holland would be left alone, while the forces would now start to pound on the Belgians. But their priority at this time was still to engulf Poland in flames. Though they were not as powerful as the French, many of them did not give up without a fight. The Austrians and Russians made headway each day, but it came at a great cost. The offensive started by the Portuguese ended in total failure. Not only were they pushed back, but they were also broken up even more. Now the chances were very likely that they would completely be obliterated from the area, as some were now stuck in areas that they could not be evacuated from. On the western coast of France, reinforcements had arrived from Portugal and Spain that were eager to fight. By now, the Syndicalists were able to push the front line back east. Poland still held on, despite not having a chance. The Finnish soldiers attacked from the north and wrote back to their family how brave the enemy soldiers were for standing their ground despite all the loss and bloodshed. The flanking Syndicalist force continued to eat away at taking ground and possibly to take away all ports in the French territory. If they managed to do this, all future Entente reinforcements needed to head in through Italy, greatly delaying and decreasing their effectiveness. By attacking alongside the coast, the Commune of France was now able to attack Entente troops via their south side, attacking them from two sides at once and dealing major damage. The Entente members screamed for aid from Austria and Russia, but they were not about to leave the Polish region that was about to fall. Entente infantry and armor divisions were cut off in large chunks, and the Syndicalist vengeance was swift and deadly. Many took the invasion of France personal, and those who surrendered on the Entente side often met terrible fates once captured. Then at the end of 1943, word came out that Warsaw had fallen. Once described as the Paris of the East during the Renaissance, Warsaw hit rough times in recent memories. There was hope after the Weltkrieg of renewal, but alas, fate had not been kind, as the socialist Polish army collapsed trying to defend the city from both sides of the Vistula River from advancing Russian forces. Poland's demise was imminent, and indeed, the very next day, the country officially capitulated. What would come next would be crucial for both sides. France was on a successful offensive, but would Russia and Austria be enough to stop the advance altogether? The Second Weltkrieg was still in full effect. With Poland gone, one would think that the Internationale was on the brink of losing, but instead, it managed to regain Portugal and launch a full assault from the west. With the war going on for multiple years, different topics were discussed in the news back in the homes of the Americans and Canadians alike. The retirement of Mackenzie King was one of those topics. He led the Liberal Party of Canada since 1919, and first became Prime Minister in 1935. Louis Saint Laurent would replace him as the leader of the Liberals. The Syndicalist offensive was massive indeed. Millions of troops were involved and moved as if their masters gave them the whip. Some believed this was due to them fearing the approach of the main Austrian and Russian armies from the Far East. But for now, those armies would still be occupied around the lands that were formerly known as Poland. Though the nation had officially capitulated, there were still hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers stationed here who either chose to fight to the death or try to get themselves offshore to safety. The offensive for now was going in the favor of the Syndicalists, with them being able to push the enemy back beyond the original borders of previously capitulated Luxembourg. The cleaning up of the Internationale soldiers around Poland took longer than expected, especially as a part of the men still stationed there spearheaded up north to put as much distance between them and the Russians. Though in the center the enemies of Syndicalism were being routed, in the south a part of their armies was trying to move west alongside the coast, a tactic that previously worked for both sides. Another attack on former Portugal and Spain commenced. This time it was Greece who saw an opportunity to maintain this offensive, though the ground and soil had been poisoned by all the bombs and artillery shells dropped over the past couple of years. The Russians finally managed to split up the remaining Syndicalists along the coast. Their goal now was to kill as many as they could before they were able to evacuate. A high death toll would surely fall heavy on the Syndicalists not being able to reinforce this quickly. In America, Dwight D. Eisenhower was also not completely focusing on the war overseas. Devastation due to the Second U.S. Civil War still remained, and he set in a new plan in motion to rebuild part of the South to lift spirits domestically, as everyone's sons were fighting in Europe. Austrian's Karl I concentrated everything on air production. Though his units were moving westward, for the time being, he wanted to help out the Kingdom of France, Canada, Romania, and all others who fought the Syndicalists from the skies above. The Second Weltkrieg had cost the lives of almost 30 million soldiers, thereby greatly surpassing the military casualty numbers during the First Weltkrieg. The Romanians gained a lot of traction in the south of France. Though they did not secure a large amount of land in the north, they pretty much secured all of the southern coastline, meaning that reinforcements could arrive from this location once more. By the 25th of July 1944, the last of the remaining Syndicalists were driven into a corner. As they still held the port, some of the men were able to escape in the final hours, while the others all perished to the Russians. Canada was gearing up for another assault. This time, they would pull out all the stops and use the latest technologies to get the overhand. It would take some time, but their next assault would involve around 200,000 troops armed with machine guns, accompanied by the latest modern armor, the Centurion tank. In Portugal, a pincer attack was occurring after seeing the success by Greece and the Romanians on the south side of France. It was a never-ending tug-of-war, but if Portugal and Spain could be conquered and held, it would mean a death sentence to the Syndicalist French. But the Commune's army was still robust and strong, demoralizing their enemies at some fronts, as it seemed impossible for them to strike this hard after having witnessed so much setback in the past. In the final month of 1944, the pincer attack and two forces connected and would now move up north. It was a similar pattern that was witnessed in the offensives concerning mostly Portugal and the US. As 1945 rolled by, the French, as expected, sent forces to battle for Portugal, and since they had conquered it many times, they were expected to do so once more. However, the amount of countries that were involved in this particular offensive were more than before, and they made sure to properly supply their troops once they got on shore to fight against the Syndicalist French. By now, the Romanian attack alongside the coast had been routed by the Internationale, and they were being pushed back eastward, creating more space between the two fronts and giving the Commune time to plan and move their pieces on the chessboard. Halfway through 1945, their counterattack commenced, and initially the expected result was gained, as the combined troops met fierce resistance that they could not cope with. In order to retrieve some pressure from the forces around Spain, the West Indies attempted another naval invasion, and this time used more than 5,000 troops in order to get a good foothold on enemy territory. But even though they used more troops than most countries did during their naval invasions, it was not enough to get a good grip, and in the end, the attempt was all for naught. In India, things were stirring up as well. The Bharatian Commune declared war on the Indian Empire to the south, and chances were likely that the Dominion might get swept in on this during the chaos. At the end of August, an interesting turn of events occurred. To get a better angle on fighting across the entire Central European line, the Commune of France realized that they would have to hold positions in Holland as well. Thus, they declared war on the small country that has already prepared troops at their borders, since neighboring Belgium was in combat long before. Even so, the French poured into their lands with ease alongside the front line with the Entente and hoped to attack the other nations like Russia and Austria via a northern approach. In the first week of October, the Dominion of India got involved with the war of their neighbors. At first glance, they were heading deeper into the Commune territory to get a foothold, but requested America to send reinforcements to at least avoid being pushed back deeper to their side of the border. The Syndicalist French around Spain went down south to break up the Greek and Entente armies to split their supply and reinforcement lines. It looked, once again, like their enemies would lose this landmass that had known war for pretty much a decade. The Syndicalists had a bit more trouble fighting through Holland though. At places like Nijmegen and Eindhoven, they stumbled on fierce resistance as the Dutch were reinforced by Russians and Austrians to the east. In India, the war unfolded in a three-way conflict, as the Indian Empire now also declared war on the Dominion. The Dominion's government now urged the US to speed up the sending of reinforcements. On the west coast of the Kingdom of France, new naval invasions had successfully been pulled off. Both the Americans and the Finnish led the way and were sure to use enough manpower to hold and secure the captured ports. By this time, Canada had mustered over 200,000 new fresh troops that were ready and eager to be sent over to Europe. The news of the successful naval invasions greenlit their departure as they headed into the war. But something very important was happening now in terms of the war. France was showing signs of crackling down. With three main fronts, it could no longer divide all their troops to ensure the invaders be driven out. The Americans were able to move east. As everyone's eyes were fixated on Central Europe, Japan crept ever so closer, stabbing the Russians from behind. In the final days of 1945, the unthinkable had finally been done. The French syndicalist forces stationed in Spain had been entirely cut off from their main armies and supply lines. They were now on their own. The 200,000 Canadians were on their way to the French shore, but officers told them that they would need to prepare for another battle. The battle they had been waiting for all these years. In January of 1946, the French Commune managed to create an opening again to Spain. But by doing this, the Americans and Finnish could move even further land inward. By then, France had stationed more men along that line, but it was already too late. The French were broken, and during the next 3 weeks, they suffered loss after loss. Until finally the unbelievable message appeared in the newspapers. The Commune of France had capitulated. The leftovers still in Spain were rounded up and killed if they resisted. To most soldiers, the message that the Commune had lost did not arrive until many days later. During the peace conference, France claimed ownership over its old countryside. The Russians and Austrians were at that moment still in control over the former German territory. With the Kingdom of France now having its former territory back, spirits were uplifted all across the Entente. But the Weltkrieg was not over yet, and to many Canadians and exiled British, the main battle of which people spoke over 10 years ago was now at hand. The battle for Britain, the final chapter in this onslaught, was about to begin. By the beginning of 1946, many people believed that the Second Weltkrieg was coming to an end. The Commune of France, seen by many as the strongest nation within the syndicalist Third International, had been brought to its knees. A few thousand soldiers were stranded amongst the dust in the area of former Spain with no way out. They would die there while others surrendered. The remaining target was the Union of Britain that stood together with Scotland and the Welsh Union. Battles at sea were fierce, as the syndicalist British threw all of their resources at the enemy. It would prove a very difficult task to penetrate the walls and bunkers at the shores of the British Isles. Many thought that even the British syndicalists realized that they could no longer win the war, but they were damn sure to not let any invaders come into their home. They swore to fight off the invaders' attempts again and again and again. Though for some, the victory over the Commune of France seemed the most important, to Canada and King Edward VIII, the real prize was to recapture their old homeland. He was happy that this battle would be the last. King Edward had hundreds of thousands of soldiers and tanks stationed in France at the ready for when a naval invasion by its allies had been pulled off successfully. Its ally, the Dominion of India, would probably not take part in those attempts, as it had to deal with a three-way civil war with its neighboring factions. America had notified the Indian government that help was on the way. Naval battles had come all the way to the waters between Britain and Ireland, yet the naval forces were not able to even make a dent in the British defenses. The first naval invasion attempt was done by the West Indies. It was hastily and without real consequences, as they did not attack any place that had a port for reinforcements. All military units participating in this attack lost their lives. By April of 46, almost all remaining British soldiers had been dealt with at areas that were now dominated by Portugal and Greece. By then, Britain had lost over 2 million men during the Weltkrieg, but nevertheless, their spirits were high and the people believed they could hold their island for many years to come. The ever-increasing aggressiveness of the nation of Japan helped fuel these thoughts, as Russia realized it had to put more focus and finances to that front to the east. Then halfway through September, the Kingdom of France attempted to invade Britain with a bigger army than the West Indies had. As all the areas with a port or dockyard were heavily defended, Areas further away were chosen to attack. But the soldiers suffered heavy losses during the beach invasion, and enemy reinforcements from nearby towns were quick to respond. Canada also had 10,000 troops at the ready to support an invasion by one of their allies to hopefully divide the attention of the Syndicalists. The second time that the Kingdom of France tried to invade, the attacks went better. They had help from the West Indies and altogether sent out almost 20,000 troops along the shoreline. The Canadians, together with the Dutch and American units, tried to then put pressure on the shores to the west, but were not able to get through dangerous waters completely shut down by coastal artillery. In the end, the Kingdom of France was not able to secure any harbors, and the attack resulted in a complete failure. By the end of 1946, Britain still stood strong as ever. The beginning of 1947 brought good news to the American people. The heavy blows dealt to the Syndicalists made Mexico realize that its ideology was faltering throughout the world. Though it was not part of the Internationale faction, its government knew that many suspected talks were made behind people's back for a possible coalition. As a showcase of good faith, and in the hopes not to provoke America to declare war on Mexico to get its former Pacific states back, they were returned by Mexico without bloodshed. Though Central Europe was focused on the British Isles, the Eastern European countries were worried about the Japanese that kept conquering land throughout Russia. In India, French and American reinforcements had arrived, and though the opposing factions were able to delve a bit deeper into the Dominion's lands, they were soon halted and reversed. Then in June of 1947, the Americans had a go on invading Britain. They chose the outer point in the southwest to avoid being flanked from other sides. But the front they faced was narrow, and the enemy had heavy artillery and guns set up along the road. The British coastal cliff battles took a heavy toll on the Americans. Their attack was halted in merely 3 weeks. France then tried again and was defeated once more. It started to resemble a repeating scenario like the assaults on the Spanish soil, only this time the Entente forces managed to barely gain any ground during the attacks. It had almost been 2 years since the Commune of France had fallen, and Britain still remained whole. That's when people started to realize that this could go on for a long time. But then all eyes shifted towards the Russian front with the Japanese, as on the 11th of September of 1947, the first nuclear bomb was dropped in Kemerovo. Who ordered the dropping of the bomb was unclear. Some blamed the Japanese, others the Koreans. In any case, this disaster resulted in Russia focusing even more on the war against the Japanese, but also boosted a significant number of men who volunteered to join the forces as they found the atomic bombing a personal offense. The conquered land by Japan so far was puppeted to Siberia, with the government pledging loyalty to the co-prosperity sphere with Japan as its leader. The Russians had much more manpower than their opposition, revealing partly why up until now they had not paid too much attention to this particular conflict. But with the atomic attack, everything changed, and the co-prosperity sphere would taste the bitter revenge by the Russian people. Then on November 15th, news was released on Bulgaria. The death of the late Tsar Ferdinand I had caused the Bulgarian people to come together and mourn the man that had brought them and the nation to its golden age and had successfully maintained that golden age. The Tsar's death had saw the ascension of his son, now crowned Tsar Boris III, which was a momentous occasion for Bulgarians around the world. Beloved by many, the new Tsar had promised to bring change within and without, starting with a new regime change. The Dominion of India and the Bharatiya Commune were still interwoven in a bloody war, but the Indian Empire to the south was crippled and on its last legs. In Britain, things went as usual, with another invasion doomed to fail. This time though, the Austrians managed to pull off a successful invasion at the same time at the Welsh side. Russia kept its promise to now focus more on the battle with Japan, and sent out millions of troops to the front who were eager to avenge those fallen during the bombing, but also years of war and had been ignored. Halfway through 1948, the Dominion of India took control of the Indian Empire and were now able to attack the Syndicalists to the east from two sides. The major addition of American troops and two-angle opportunity made it clear that the Dominion would be the victor in this conflict. The amount of units gearing up and assembling in France for whenever a naval invasion was successful on Britain was staggering. The moment a port would be taken, Britain would surely be lost. By September, the Commune in India realized too that it could no longer win. Not even a week later, they capitulated. Since the end of the Weltkrieg, the Indian subcontinent had been split into three sides: the loyalist remnants of the British Raj, the socialists of the Indian National Congress, and the reactionary Indian princes who rejected both sides. With the dust having finally settled, the loyalists had proven triumphant, and the Dominion of India now ruled unopposed over the region, setting itself up to become a preeminent world power once it recovered from the devastation of civil war. Now this meant that the American reinforcements, as well as the main army of the Dominion of India, could now focus on Central Europe to hopefully get a foothold on British soil. The Russians were successful in their push against the co-prosperity sphere. The enemy was halted and was now being forced east. Because of the massive span of land that they needed to be routed through, experts believed that this war would still continue for the next 10 years or so. Day in, day out, for months at a time, bombing campaigns were launched to weaken the fortified coastal lines. Yet time and time again, invasion attempts were halted, and soldiers died, achieving nothing in the end. It was almost 3 years since the Commune of France had fallen, and the Union of Britain still held. It was January of 1949, and the French launched another invasion in the same sense that the Americans tried before, by using the southwestern point and set up a proper front to the eastland inward. The Americans attacked at the same time to the east near a small harbor town. Though the 12,000 initial troops managed to achieve some victories here and there, they soon met fierce resistance with sent-in reinforcements. Even the Dutch attacked as well to spread the British opposition as thinly as they could. But on all three locations, eventually, they were defeated and pushed back into the sea. The next invasion planned by the French would take place in September of that year and would involve more than 50,000 men. With Bulgarian help to the west, initially they seemed to maintain some taken land again, but were still not able to secure any ports and harbors. The British knew how vital these locations were, and had done their best to secure them as well as possible. But then halfway of December, the word came out that a combined assault force had finally been able to secure a port and held it. Immediately, troops from all nations were sent over to help secure and pierce deeper into the British lands to conquer it from the Syndicalists. But the British raised the alarm. Ferocious artillery and plane bombardments leveled their port. In their eyes, it was better to destroy it than to have the enemy keep it. Eventually, the incoming soldiers were killed on land, at sea, or were forced to move back as the British still held their territory. With the Weltkrieg now being focused on solely Britain, to many Canadians, life seemed to go by its old self again for the last few years. Though they were aware that there was a war going on overseas, to many of them, it was only a matter of time before it would end. In 1950, the general elections were held again. It was mainly due to the fact that the Weltkrieg was still roaming on that the Conservatives achieved an easy victory. Through the first half of 1950, there were barely any invasion attempts after having suffered so many defeats. In August, France tried it once more from the Welsh side. This too ended in failure. By now though, the Entente had managed to capture a small island off the coast with its own port. Future naval invasions would be planned from this position. It gave them a quick response time for when an invasion would be considered a success. That success arrived in late June of 1951, 5 years after the Commune of France had fallen. It was thanks to the Bulgarians that they captured the dockyard, and immediately troops were sent from all over. More than 200,000 Canadian troops were immediately hauled over to make sure that this port would be secured no matter the cost. The Bulgarians, now supported by the Russians, had set up a defensive line, and the British Syndicalists were not able to puncture through it. Then 50,000 Romanian troops arrived. Surely the government realized that the enemy had successfully pulled off invading and setting their claws into their homeland. This was the beginning of the end. After the first 200,000 Canadian troops had arrived, another 200,000 were called over. The spirits of the Canadian soldiers were high. The emotions of some of the exiled British soldiers showed in that some could not hide the expressions in their faces when they set foot on British soil. This was what many of their fathers and mothers had lost back during the Krieg. Then from July onward, over 500,000 men from different countries would steamroll over British land in what would be known as Operation Eversio, meaning overthrowing or overturning in Latin. The battles were brutal, bloody, and relentless. The forces fighting the Syndicalists laid waste to the enemy time and time again. The tide had completely turned in that the invaders suffered almost no defeats. In the second week of August, word came out that Scotland had fallen. At the same time that Operation Eversio occurred in the south, the Austrians attacked from the north, and the Scottish stood no chance as their reserves were scrambled to protect the southern areas. More and more dockyards were secured, meaning more reinforcing troops from other countries could come ashore as well. The Welsh Union was about to fall, and in the 2 months of combat, the British lost almost 1,000,000 men to the overwhelming invading force. On the 19th of August, the Welsh Union indeed capitulated, and all that was left was the crippled Union of Britain. They were being attacked and overrun from 3 sides. Then on the 23rd of August 1951, the message, "London has fallen," soared through radio broadcasts worldwide. Many saw this as a death blow to the Syndicalists. But despite losing such a massive city, about 1,000,000 British soldiers were still fighting, determined to give it their all for their homeland against the enemy. With victory at hand, the attitude of the Canadian soldiers changed. They knew they were not going to lose this war, so all they cared about was getting home alive from the missions they were sent on. Through this, there came a certain slowdown during some attacks, as no one wanted to die right at the end when victory was so near. Cities were laid to ash, and many of the exiled British seemed bitter about the British Syndicalists labeled in their eyes as traitors of their country. There were still hundreds of thousands of troops stationed in France to be shipped over to aid the attack to conquer what was left of Britain. Only a slither of the former British army was now left. Many soldiers deserted, surrendered, or committed suicide. And then the final battle of the Second Weltkrieg took place in the city of Manchester. On the 12th of September 1951, the Union of Britain officially capitulated, and with that, an end was made to the Second Weltkrieg. For the next weeks, nation leaders came together to divide the conquered territories amongst the victors. The Entente was the dominant party and therefore got the best results. As Russia was still involved with a war with the co-prosperity sphere, they and Austria still held control of the former German lands. Once the dust had settled, several countries had gained new territory. Portugal gained control of the former Spanish territory, representing their landmass after the first 2 successful assaults against the Iberian Federation. Romania held control of Italy, thereby strengthening their grip and power over its neighboring countries. Austria received Polish lands, which they partially puppeted to keep the monarchists calm and reinstate a government similar to that before the Second Weltkrieg.